Warhammer the Horus Heresy. Campaigns of the Age of Darkness. The Battle for Beta Garmon. The Crucible of a Dark Age. We shall fight for every last world, every last city, and to the last bolt in our arsenal. In victory, Horus shall be our master only of ruin, and the emperor of a dead realm. Attributed to Miras Gilrastis, military advisor to the Palatine lords of Beta Garmon. The Beta Garmon cluster was the graveyard of the Imperium. Here, billions upon billions of lives were thrown into the raging fires of Horus's ambition and Dorne's desperation. Discarded without thought or pause to feed the fighting that was consuming the dominion of mankind. A realm once powerful and prosperous was reduced to ruin, its triumph laid low, and people slaughtered at the whim of distant warlords and generals. This was the fate of the Imperium writ in blood for all to see, a grim and fearful darkness of eternal war. For Horus to rise, all the realms of Garmon must endure that fate, and for the Imperium to live then, at least some fragment of Garmon's broken glory must survive. Dorne, the Seneschal of Terra, had seen the inhuman cost already paid to hold the Garmon cluster, had heard the name by which history would refer to this folly. Yet even he could not stop that which was now underway, only feed the flames of death and war in the hope that it would consume his enemies even as it did his own servants. To that end, he would throw his own brothers, Sanguinius and Yagatai, into the crucible. This was the bitter end of the Horus Heresy, the last reward due those that had blackened the Emperor's dream of unity. This was the great slaughter in all its terrible glory. The Garmon Cluster. The Garmon Cluster stood as the last Imperial redoubt on the path to Terra, a final bulwark after which the armies of the Warmaster would stand before the very gates of the Imperial Palace. It was a loose hegemony of systems ruled over by the Garmonite lords, the chief of which were the Palatine lords of Beta Garmon, and had long been a stronghold of industry and linchpin of the Great Crusade. Wedged between the Vale of Canth, it comprised half a dozen major systems and hundreds of smaller outposts, a vast territory that linked the most stable routes into and out of the Segmentum Solar. This would be the decisive battleground for Horus's rebellion, the breach in Dorne's defenses that would lead the Warmaster to Terra itself. Preface. I dare not hope for the future of the Imperium, for I know the horrors of its past. War came to the Garmon cluster, and worlds were split asunder. The death scream of billions echoed through the Imperium. It was a place like so many others, where once life had thrived, but was now a place that became so familiar with death that it was forever darkened. Weapons of apocalyptic power were leveled to unleash their unspeakable fury, and in the fires they wrought, entire armies were consumed. Full legions of titans walked and fell. Machines built to emulate the gods of old were cut down amidst the tempest of battles that saw cities smashed to dust and ruin. In the space of each heartbeat, so many lives were lost that the warriors who fought for the Garmon cluster became numbed to grief. They paid no mind to reverence, for they too may perish before the tears of their mourning had dried upon their bloodied cheeks. Into this crucible of destruction, the Praetorian sent forth his armies to hold against the coming of the Warmaster. His champions, Sanguinius and Yagatai Khan, were forced to exert their strength to defend the Imperium of mankind, to stem the tide of devastation that lapped at Terra's bounds. From this unthinkable task, no victory could be gleaned, merely a demonstration of the defiance of the Imperium. Herein is an account of the Garmon cluster, a place destroyed, not in a desperate struggle for victory, instead laid to waste in a battle for survival, the outcome of which would decide the fate of mankind. The War for the Garmon Cluster. All have witnessed the horrors unleashed in mankind's darkest hours, but they are naught compared to what has awoken. Unsanctioned inscriptions applied to the Sector Municipalis, Bulkhead A63, quadrant of the Imperial planets. Swiftly, the shadow of Horus's betrayal enveloped the galaxy. The initial acts of fratricide committed at Istavan III became a pall of darkness that spread throughout the Imperium. The fell power of prescribed weapons was once again unleashed upon the field of battle, no longer levelled against the Xenos threats that encroached upon the borders of the Imperium, but upon those who had bled to establish its foundations and raised it to grandeur. Brother fought brother with all the vitriolic fervour that mankind had once vented upon the alien and the despot at the frontiers of the domain of the Emperor. The Warmaster's armies were joined by new and terrifying threats, beings of murder and hatred made manifest, coaxed forth through tears in the fabric of reality itself by the dying screams of billions. They joined alongside the ranks of space marines and human warriors that swore allegiance to the Warmaster, to bring death to the Imperium of mankind. No place was spared the onset of apocalyptic destruction. Chthoniya, the home world of the Warmaster, was embroiled in a bitter war between the Imperial fists and the sons of Horus that would see the planet broken to fragments. The splendour of verdant Calth, a glittering jewel amongst the 500 worlds of Ultramar, was scoured by the radiation of its wounded sun, part of a ritual performed by the Word-bearers to stir the ruined storm itself into being. In the Segmentum Tempestus, the surface of Talon was reduced to an irradiated wasteland by the virus bombs of the Iron Warriors. Another lush and plentiful world laid to waste under the heels of the traitor host. With the destruction of these worlds and many more like them, billions of humans experienced torturous suffering beyond the scope of imagination. They were caught in the tempest of a war between the grandest armies ever raised by mankind, led by warrior demigods, the Primarchs, born for this purpose. Many were found longing for death as an escape from the horror-filled existence within the ruins of the galaxy that once was. Oblivion, no matter the means by which it came, began to appeal as a tempting respite from the reality of life that now awaited them. The warriors of the Emperor's legions would not wish for such an escape, and instead, divided by betrayal, they would fight on, desperate to prevail as the tempest of war burned around them, driven by the bitter enmity for their cousins, who they had once known as kin. Internecine war reached every corner of the Imperium. In addition to the legions, now divided by their loyalties even within their own ranks, the Martian Mechanicum were embroiled in a civil war that engulfed the Red Planet. Factions within their coalition aligned with either the Emperor or Horus, and swore to destroy the other in a bid for control of the forges of Mars and their production of machines and weapons, the tools of war itself. Each of the thousands of solar auxiliar cohorts was forced to choose their side as their domains were shrouded by the creeping darkness of Horus Lupercal's betrayal. In the same manner, the countless billions under arms that formed the Imperial Army and the militia auxilia throughout the reaches of the galaxy were forced to stand with the Emperor or to bear aloft the banner of the Eye of Horus and join the Warmaster's crusade upon Terra. The advance on Terra. The armies of Horus fought not merely to seed chaos and destruction across the burning galaxy. At the command of the Warmaster, the traitor host sought to take Terra, the seat of the Emperor's power over the Imperium itself. Although their actions appeared as little more than a headlong push for the Sol system, the Warmaster and his allies marched upon Terra along a measured path, each victory in battle constituting a single bloody step towards the gates of the Imperial Palace. The paths these incremental steps followed were determined and shaped by the whims of the prevailing currents of the Imperial, that swirling and billowing realm that spanned an infinite and unmeasurable space beyond the bounds of physical reality. To follow these paths, many of which were only mapped by the trial and error of early warp voyages, facilitated the most rapid and reliable travel throughout the galaxy, and it was along these conduits that Horus's armada moved. Although the Warmaster's forces, aided by the pantheon of dark gods that they served, and favoured by the whims of unreality, suffered less in the perilous turbulence of warp energy due to their malevolent allegiance. The forces of the Imperium relied on these routes for resupply and reinforcements. It was by these actions that Horus sought to block and impede with the presence of his own forces. The Garmon cluster sat at a waypoint between Primarch and Terra, on one side of the most stable and predictable warp conduits to the west of the galactic core. It represented a pass through the mountain ranges of the Imperial and would be a critical staging point for the Warmaster's final assault on Terra. Through the Garmon cluster, Horus would be able to direct his fleets rapidly and accurately from throughout the Ultima Segmentum and the secondary sectors, and bear down with irresistible force on the loyalists within the Segmentum Solar, at the same time depriving Dorne of a route by which reinforcements could reach Terra and the resources of the cluster itself. Significant numbers of loyalist troops were deployed within the many systems of the Garmon cluster, in concentrations around the Majoris grade systems, such as Beta Garmon, the site of Neocon City, the capital of the cluster, and Theta Garmon, which was the location of vast shipyards and Imperial battlefleet facilities. The Great Muster, as it was known, was intended to ensure that the Garmon cluster remained under Imperial control as part of the extended defense lines before Horus's oncoming. Owing to this, the Garmon cluster would play host to some of the most pivotal and cataclysmic battles of the Horus Heresy. In the sea of fire, thousands of ships would burn in war zones so vast that tallies of their dead could never hope to be recorded. Billions would perish during the Great Slaughter, a war so grand that the funeral pyres of its fallen would burn for 1,000 years. More would perish at Neocon City alone than had in the conquest of entire sectors of the galaxy, and the monumental events of the Titan death would inflict damage so extensive that even by the labor of 100 generations, it could not be repaired. 2 loyal sons of the Emperor would be sent forth, both the Primarch Sanguinius and Yagatai Khan, the only of their kind that remained able to, and would find their strength and resolve tested in holding back the might of their traitorous kin, Horus Lupercal, and his host. The Ruin Storm. The lawyer's capabilities to send and support reinforcements into the cluster were hampered by the Ruin Storm, a tempestuous disturbance in the immaterium, a storm that swallowed the stars themselves, that was called forth with the culmination of arcane rituals conducted by the word-bearers on distant Calth. Lesser effects were felt by the traitors who, in the shadows, enacted malevolent schemes to bolster their numbers and subjugate the worlds of the Garmon cluster. Operatives of the Alpha Legion and companies of Emperor's children, having awaited the time to rise up during the Garmon cluster's isolation, sent even prior to the rousing of the Ruin Storm as infiltrators and agents of disorder, destabilized the control of the Garmonite lords. Titan legios and knight households were set in opposition, bringing their cataclysmic weapons to bear in battle, embroiling worlds throughout the cluster in open warfare, as control was wrested back and forth between traitor and loyalist control. In the face of such wanton destruction, Dorne's Great Muster was sent into disarray, and instead of a cohesive loyalist force, the defenders of the Garmon cluster were fragmented and disorganized, fighting as isolated pockets of resistance. Only with the cataclysmic destruction of Davin and the resultant waning of the Ruin Storm did the warp turbulence that shrouded the Garmon cluster abate and allow Rogel Dorne to commit further reinforcements to break the Warmaster's momentum. Any effort to repel or destroy Horus's forces within the Garmon cluster would be costly, but minuscule in comparison to the price of ceding the territory. If Loyalist forces were to retreat from the sector and fall back to the Segmentum Solar, there would be little to prevent the Warmaster's armada from filling the vacuum between them and establishing a direct route through which to march his armies upon Terra. Even as humanity itself was divided and burgeoning darkness threatened to smother all that was light, a fire still burned in the hearts of many. In some, the fire was fueled by hope. A belief that all could be rebuilt in the wake of Horus's betrayal, if only his advance on Terra could be halted. In others, fires of hatred burned, fueled by the desire to exact vengeance upon the Emperor's treacherous son and all that followed him. None, however, were ignorant to the fact that there could be no peace for mankind now, for no loyal son could bear to tolerate the existence of a traitor, and no traitor could rest while a single loyal soul stood in defiance. The Praetorian's command. Let the seas boil, let the stars fall. Though it takes the last drop of my blood, I will see the galaxy freed once more. Horus Lupercal. Horus would return to Terra. Although destined as it was, the Warmaster foresaw the vital importance of the timing of his assault on the throne world and the manner in which it must be delivered. If he struck before the time was right, he risked doing so with forces unprepared, lacking their full number and momentum, without the aid of the pantheon of his dark masters, and with his might still in ascendancy. To strike too late, and Dorne, the Praetorian of Terra, would have the opportunity to muster his defensive strength, and the might of Guilliman, the Lion, and their legions would be at the Warmaster's back, forcing his armies to fight on two fronts. For Horus, delay would increase the likelihood of defeat, but to descend upon the throne world recklessly was no better. If Terra, and with it the Imperium itself, were to fall into the Warmaster's grasp, then it would require both cunning strategy and an amassed host of the kind never before seen in all the realms of mankind. The Garmon cluster would prove vital for both, and set at the crux of Horus's onslaught. To waylay Horus, trap him in the Garmon cluster, and delay his inevitable assault on Terra, Dorne ordered not one, but two Primarchs into the region, Sanguinius and Yagatai Khan. Accompanied by their respective battle hosts, were drawn from the inner defences of the Sol system and Terra itself, and called upon to ride out from behind their walls and meet their foe. These two were amongst the greatest warriors and generals that yet remained within the Sol system, brothers born to reclaim the stars in the name of their father, but now forced to stand guardian over the ruins of his dreams. Both had been tested in battles beyond the ken of any mortal soldier, had conquered foes beyond count, and were eager to test their mettle against their treacherous brothers. Despite their glorious legacies, Dorne was forced to select Sanguinius not for his superhuman charisma that willed supplication and fealty from his lessers, nor Yagatai for his fearsome prowess as a crusading warrior, but simply because they were all that remained of their kind in defense of the birthplace of humanity. Not idly, though, did the Praetorian send his brothers beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace, for their absence undermined the very integrity of the defense of Terra. However, so too did their absence from the Garmon cluster undermine the chances of victory there, for only they held the strength necessary to delay the oncoming of Horus. Terra's governing council was riven by such a bold decision. Several subordinate sector commanders and grand generals of the Imperial army reckoned such a course of action to be too reckless and uncharacteristic of the Primarch of the 7th Legion. Following this, a coup was birthed in the cloisters of Terra's great command strategiums. An open questioning of Lord Dorne's orders followed, with some so bold as to voice doubts of the Primarch's motivations. Arguments were made that the loyal Primarchs would perform such a pivotal role in the defense that to have them sent forth beyond the lines of the terrestrial defense was needlessly risky, and left the Imperial Palace without contingency in the event of failure. The generals conspired to deny the Praetorian the assistance of their armies, insisting that entire numerous companies of troops, and themselves composed of many hundreds of thousands of troops, would not leave Terra, and instead remain within the walls of the palatial defences. Division Marshal Dene Korst accused the Praetorian of duplicity and betrayal during a strategic council assembly of minor-grade overseers, instigating an unruly rebellion that threatened to ignite the chambers of command at the heart of the Imperium, which had become a tinderbox of paranoia and suspicion. Elsewhere, violence erupted, and the blood of dissenters was spilled upon the white marble steps of the Sanctum Centrum, as Palatine arbitration squads were forced to bring lawless protests to order with deadly force. The Khan responded by interrupting the ceaseless training of his warriors to place them on alert, ready to respond to any further uprisings with their overwhelming might. He viewed the unrest to be instigated by privileged bureaucrats who had earned no place to criticize the methods of warfare, and instead promised that further dissent would result in the enforcement of the order by the blades of the 5th Legion. Sanguinius acted in response to these rebellions, not with escalating violence, but by taking to the streets and walking amongst the people to call for unity, imploring the renegade generals to heed Dorne's command, insistent that his strategy was in the interest of the Imperium's defense. It was through the great general's brokering of diplomacy that a summit of the War Council of Terra was held, assembling even those who had held the most opposed and conflicting views within the same auditorium, before the ranks of thousands of warriors who had gathered in the parade squares, drill spaces, and barrack houses of Terra's defense installations. The image of Rogel Dorne was projected via holocast. Where such technology was not available, his voice was transmitted across a network of emergency vox emitters that were intended to be able to alert Terra's inhabitants in the event of an attack. Dorne reasserted his orders by simple repetition, his voice stern and unwavering, seemingly able to cut through the meter-thick ferrocrete walls that reinforced every sector of the Imperial Palace. The Praetorian's decree. "It is I, Rogel Dorne, appointed Praetorian of Terra, who speaks to you now. But no, my voice is the vessel of the will of the Emperor of mankind, and with it I make this command. My kin, Sanguinius, the great angel, lord of the 9th Legion, and Yagatai Khan, the Warhawk, master of the 5th Legion, are given leave of the bonds of Terra to exert their rightly dominion over the worlds of the Garmon cluster, and to turn back the insurrection of the perfidious Horus and his followers. Their absence will be felt in the hearts of all who reside here upon this imperial domain, but I will accept no insubordination in response. To doubt this command is to doubt the very will of the Emperor. Terra demands that we stand in unity and cast out indecision, for within indecision lies the path to duplicity. If any amongst you possess within them the desire to question such authority, you may seek passage to my quarters, where you will find their doors unbarred, and within them you may speak freely of your apprehensions before me. In this, the will of the Emperor is made plain." Transcript ends. In the conclusion of his short and direct address, he demanded that everyone who still questioned them should present their concerns directly in person within his quarters, for the doorways to them would be left open for any to venture within. Rogel Dorne would make this offer, but none came forth, for it was through the ministrations of Sanguinius that mutual understanding had been reached, even before the Praetorian had spoken. What was not known throughout the diplomatic chambers of the Imperium's greatest command centre was that Rogel Dorne had in fact acknowledged the strategy as having risks beyond even the gravest any dare make utterance of. Despite the unmoving stoicism of Dorne's demeanour, within, he wrestled with the potential consequences of the decision Horus had forced him to make. Should either of his loyal brothers be lost as they played their part in this daring gambit, the impact on the defense of Terra would be incalculable, and the fate of the Imperium would be cast to the winds. For much as Rogel longed to go in the place of Sanguinius, it could not be. Nor would he entertain the prospect of shackling the Khan with the responsibility that the role of Praetorian entailed, as the Emperor's appointed Primarch. Chosen to act in the stead of the Master of Mankind, Dorne must remain and await the coming of the Warmaster. The Mortification Index. Within the Garmon cluster, Dorne's objective was not to strive for the slimmest chance of victory, but instead to merely hold off absolute defeat for as long as possible. In order to gauge the success of his endeavor, whole communities of Militarum adepts formed from generations of laborers that lived only to fulfill their predisposed roles toiled at the cogitator banks within the grand stratagem of the Praetorian to determine what was known as the Mortification Index, a vast and carefully calculated algorithm by which the viability of the actions within the Garmon cluster and the resultant threat to Terra and the Imperial Palace could be judged. In order to preserve the already fraught morale of the Loyalist forces, the two parameters of the Mortification Index, or Death Clock, as it became known to them in keeping with the now common gallows humour that had been adopted, were not known. Outside of the Terran-based command, the Primarchs and the highest-ranked members of the Divisio Militaris, none knew the critical numbers at which victory could be claimed, or even effective defeat occurred. It was assumed that the deaths of individual humans caused an almost imperceptible impact on the index, but when multiplied across entire squadrons, formations, and cohorts, the effect was cumulative, with each additional formation and war machine having a more profound impact on the index itself. It was also reckoned that the loss of either loyal Primarch would negatively impact the index to such a degree the method of measure would become irrelevant. But throughout the Imperial forces, soldiers would make boastful jests at their own worth, according to the index, making light of the fact that their continued existence had been reduced to a simple numerical value. The Brothers' Oath. Aboard the great capital ship Phalanx, Dorne privately held court with both Yagatai and Sanguinius. With preparations underway for the great battle host of the 5th and 9th Legions to make way for the Garmon cluster, the Praetorian chose for them to convene not within the windowless interiors of the great bastion that surrounded the epicenter of the Imperium, but within his own sanctum. Only there could adequate perspective be gained, where the orb of Terra itself could be seen, framed within a single viewing port of the mightiest vessel of the Imperial fleet. The three loyal brothers could gaze upon the one place when the entirety of humanity had, at one point, lived and died, in an uncharacteristically emotional display, the likes of which would be revealed only to his brothers. Dorne wished to impress the importance of the mission he had devised. As Luna's shadow slowly crept across the grey-blue sphere of Terra, the Praetorian spoke to his brothers in the manner of a tutor, as he was prone to doing. He spoke of the history of humanity, of his learning of ancient civilizations, and of the triumphs of the tribes of old Earth. Times of glory and of enlightenment that had been and gone in the passage of time, and long-dead kings and tyrants whose bones had become dust before mankind had ventured out into the stars. Dorne spoke the great victories of the Imperium, many of which the great angel had enacted by his own hand. Once we trod the stars themselves as our domain. None that existed could be found our equal. Just as humanity laid conquest to old Earth, we spread the borders of our domain with impunity. Those days are now behind us, only memories for us to cleave unto. Sanguinius, a scholar as he was, listened intently to the lecture, allowing the indulgence as Dorne framed the orb of Terra with his hands, as if gauging its proportions. Yagatai, though, even respectful of his brothers as he was, could not hide his impertinence at the recollection of these dead and irrelevant tales, and his gaze was drawn to the pinpoints of starlight that were visible beyond the curve of Terra's horizon, each exerting a pull on his attention. He paced the floor like a captive animal, his hand drawn to the hilt of his sword, longing once again for glorious battle at the frontiers of the Imperium. Some moments had passed before Yagatai had realized his distraction had silenced Rogul, who waited patiently to continue, as the Khan once again sat upon one of the great chaises that furnished the chamber. As the eclipse of Luna came to veil Terra in full, Dorne's oratory finally came to its point, his face hardening as shadows grew from the deep lines that had been etched across his features. Much as it was demonstrated before them by the alignment of the celestial bodies, the Warmaster's shadow threatened to envelop Terra in a darkness from which it would never emerge. The Garmon cluster would be a critical point at which this darkness could be held back, and the light of the Imperium could be allowed to eventually prevail. As close to the Praetorians' equal as any that lived, the Warhawk and the Great Angel understood the nature of the Garmon cluster and the vital role that it played in the defense against Horus, but it was not of this that Dorne wished to entreaty them. Dorne did not need to rouse the spirit of either one of his brothers to perform acts of heroism or bravery, for they were already the embodiment of such attributes, but instead he must implore them otherwise. He warned them that although the Garmon cluster must hold, their actions should not be motivated by their personal desires to exact vengeance upon their traitorous brothers, but instead they must be restrained, as should they fall in an ill-measured attempt on Lupercal himself, they would damn the defense of Terra to the same end. The Angel's March. As the red tier prepared to depart from the Sol system, its glittering gold hull latest with the scars of a lifetime at war, the navigational lights on the flanks of each escort ship within visual range blinked in a salute to the departure of the Great Angel. Despite Yagatai and his legion's prior departure, itself an understated affair reduced to a plain, logistical action by the ever-pragmatic Warhawk, Sanguinius and his war host still represented a gathering of Imperial might rarely seen since the conclusion of the Great Crusade. With ceremonial order, a hollow cast was broadcast to every ship's bridge and relayed to the pick screen in every cabin and galley, the image of Sanguinius upon the command dais of his flagship. Across the fleet, millions of crews, soldiers and space marines paused in the conduct of their duties and turned to view the nearest hollow-picture display or listened to the voxcasters as the hail began. Mighty power-armored warriors towered above the human proportions of the crowds that gathered around them, eager to catch but a glimpse of the majesty of the Great Angel himself as he prepared to deliver his address. Sanguinius began to speak. He told of Horus Lupercal, a brother he had once held dearest, how Horus had become consumed by pride, and how power had corrupted his sense of humility and duty. Of a warlord who had been corrupted by his own authority, turning against the ones he had once served, and of a brother to whom he could deliver their own salvation. In place of an account of the realities of the age, he told a tale of hope. What Sanguinius did not speak of were the things he wished to shield the Imperial forces from. He did not speak of the monsters that he had faced in the dark recesses of the galaxy, at Cygnus and at Davin, and he told not of the inescapable and ruinous influence they had over the psyche of humans. Sanguinius spared the truth, and he alone carried the burden of the horrors he had witnessed, the things that now haunted his mind, because they were things too terrible to know, things that were the ending of hope. With the conclusion of his address, void drives flared into life and combat stations were manned, setting the bulk of the fleet following the red tier and Sanguinius on a direct course for the Beta Garmon system. A chain of astropathic relays lit in the fleet's wake, carrying word of the commencement of their mission back to Terra and to Dorne. The Primarch's muster. Night has fallen, and with it has come darkness and fear. Here I bring the torch that will bring light unto the coming of a new dawn. Attributed to Sanguinius. Addressed to the 567th Solar Auxiliar Cohort. The assembled might of the White Scars and the Blood Angels translated from the warp within the borders of the Garmon cluster to little fanfare. In any other age, the spectacle of such a gathering would be sufficient to bring an entire subsector of space to a standstill. But even the coming of two mighty Primarchs, each capable of laying conquest to entire systems with the forces under their command, would be overshadowed by the dire situation and immensity of the battles already underway. The people of the Imperium within the Garmon cluster cried out for aid. Neocon City had already been besieged by the Warmaster's armies, and the Royalist resistance was forced to adopt guerrilla tactics in order to survive. The planet of Beta Garmon 2 was contested by two vast armies, and the fires of that war threatened to consume Beta Garmon 3 as well. Imperial troops had been drawn to the outlying systems of the Garmon cluster, only for Horus to orchestrate fresh attacks on targets within Delta Garmon and Theta Garmon. Few places in the cluster were beyond the scope of the vast war, and those that still lived longed for their salvation. To mark the arrival of Sanguinius and Yagatai Khan, those that could spare time away from the front lines made good their battle-worn uniforms and unfurled their frayed and bloodied battle standards to stand to attention, paying respect to the angels they hoped would deliver them from oblivion. Sanguinius was shuttled from aboard his flagship, the Red Tier, to preside over the muster aboard the loyalist cruiser Celestial Fury as it rearmed at the Delta Garmon system. His serfs clamoured to tend to his ceremonial armour as he walked, buffing his mirror-polished plate and smoothing the drape of the exotic furs that hung at his back. Within the great launch bays of this venerable craft, itself racked by months of ceaseless war, the great angel was met with a paltry display of troops, ordered by their commanders to honour the coming of the Primarchs, despite many recovering from grievous wounds, not all to their physical bodies. The psyches of those who had so far survived the wars of the Garmon cluster were often shattered. Fear held these injured veterans in its imprisoning grasp, some forced to relive scenes of horror over and again each time they slept. Others scrambled for cover each time a bulkhead door was slammed closed within earshot, or ceaselessly sought to reload rifle magazines they no longer held. In the presence of the great angel, the fires in the hearts of these broken soldiers were stoked, and behind their glazed eyes lit a glimmer of hope. Sanguinius walked amongst the warriors and looked into their hollow eyes, windows into minds haunted by the atrocities of battle, and noted many were missing arms, legs, or both. He inquired why they had not been fitted with mechanical replacements, and was informed by his escorting staff, who spoke in hushed tones, that the supply of such items was limited and reliant on units that could be salvaged from the battlefield dead and reused. Sanguinius fought to maintain a neutral expression, and he detached one of the priceless animal furs that hung over his pauldron and draped it around the shoulders of a young soldier who balanced on a crutch, his right arm and leg missing. The soldier attempted to salute, as per the custom of his cohort, forgetting the limitations inflicted by his still recent injuries, and stumbled as he did so. His frustration giving way to tears that streamed down his filth-smeared cheeks. The angel reached forward to grasp his shoulder and steady him. He needed no thanks for this gift, and only wished that the injured man find comfort in its warmth. Yagatai followed Sanguinius in procession, looking over the assembled troops that bowed in supplication to the might of the demigods of war before them, and observed their pitiful state. He carried with him no trappings of ceremony to be given as petty gifts, and wore only his battle plate, about him hanging no favours nor trinkets, and only weapons. In the presence of the Khan, adorned in his battle panoply, men did not react as they did in the presence of Sanguinius, and instead they were cowed, and flinched with each of his thunderous footfalls, as if each were the burst of shot or shell, the cacophony of the battlefield. As he stood to bring his eyes to the level of the battered warriors that were arrayed before him in their patchwork uniforms, their wounds still bound with dressings, the Khan noted that few could bear to meet his gaze. Instead, their stares were drawn to the blade of the white tiger Dao that hung at his side, as they took in the fine latticework of thousands of scratches and dents in its bladed edge. To them, Each was a disturbing memento of the death of one of Yagatai's enemies, where the presence of his kin, Sanguinius, comforted men and inspired them to stand tall. They regarded the Khan with great caution and unease, as if they were trapped in a cage with a wild beast that had slipped its restraints. With every individual Yagatai regarded, his ire grew, until he realized that his face had hardened into a contemptuous sneer, which only served to heighten the atmosphere of tension that clung to his procession. Without word, the Khan cut his participation in the ceremonial welcome short. Tired of its futility, he turned on his heels and strode purposefully from the launch bay. His attendants bowed to the congregation, awkwardly bidding them farewell on behalf of their master, and jogged to keep pace as they turned towards the shuttle that would carry him back to his flagship. Even as the great angel continued to walk amongst the assembly of his troops, offering his thanks for the sacrifice they had already made, Yagatai had returned to the Lance of Heaven and once more assumed his position upon the command throne. The fleet set to delve into the fires of the Garmon Cluster. The Khan could not win the hearts of the people of the Imperium through charisma. He knew only the ways of war. Keen to prove his worthiness of the role that Dorne had assigned him in comparison to that of Sanguinius, the Khan drove his white scars into the Garmon Cluster with haste, overlooking the opportunity to relieve the loyalist forces held in the systems local to his point of ingress. Despite the bridge of the Lance of Heaven detecting numerous distress beacons as they passed through the sector, the Khan decreed that they would go unanswered by the 5th as he sought to reach deeper into the Garmon Cluster, where glory would await him. He had been asked to seek out the enemy and harry him wherever he was found, and so the toils of humanitarian aid would be left to Sanguinius and the fleet of the Blood Angels. Instead, Yagatai's fleet skirted the center of the Garmon Cluster under his orders to find a war away from the core systems, or to instigate one of their own making. To do so was to distract the Warmaster's troops and occupy them, so that an overwhelming concentration could not be gathered in any one place. The reality of the war being fought was that, even far from the front lines, none were ever truly beyond the predation of enemy patrols. Like the hunter-seeker organisms that lingered in the wake of dueling leviathans in the deep, cold oceans of Europa, countless fragmentary warbands cruised between the stars. Those under the Warmaster cruelly struck at targets of opportunity, keen to sow fear and disruption amongst the loyalist camp. Likewise, those loyal to the Imperium were not limited to only the forces committed to the great battle zones, and instead, some fought as piratical raiders, striking at the underbelly of the beast where they could interrupt the supply lines and logistic chains with targeted strikes. The Shattered Legions. Composed of Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard warriors, all the embittered survivors of Istvan swore to enact revenge on the traitors. Meduson's new legion was one constructed from the broken fragments of many. They fought as an intermingled force, each individual bearing the heraldry of their own parent legion, bonded together by their specializations, demeanors, or experiences on the battlefield. Whilst training and doctrines between the legions were far from standardized, the common experiences and pacts of vengeance shared by the warriors that fought under Meduson's banner were sufficient to overcome the cultural and doctrinal differences in battle. Driven by a singular and encompassing desire to seek vengeance against the Warmaster's forces, Meduson's warriors used the flexibility of their combined experience to bring war to the traitors where they were least prepared, to act as the hidden dagger that supplemented the sword and shield that the united loyalist legions represented. Continuously growing as greater numbers of loyalist troops consolidated and sought to fight their own war against the traitors, Shadrach's army ever lacked the numbers to attack the sons of Horus and their allies head-on. Despite being actively hunted by cadres of traitors, Meduson used the pervasion of untruth and misguidance surrounding his own survival and whereabouts as a shroud, and in its cover waged a disruptive war, striking measured blows at the Warmaster's armies at the fore of a contingent of what had become known as the Shattered Legions. The Hunters are the hunted. In the expanse of space between Delta Garmon and Theta Garmon, amidst the sea of Minoris grade systems, A shattered legion strike fleet had sprung upon an unsuspected convoy of bulk haulers that had seemingly little in the way of security escort or fleet protection. Upon his command Deatus, aboard the nominated command vessel Aleph 639, Shadrach Meduson was interlinked with a trio of his delegate commanders, and together they monitored the screens of cogitator banks to coordinate the attack of their strike force. In near silence, various squadrons were readied and sent the signal to attack in perfect synchronicity, as boarding torpedoes and Charybdis assault claws were launched at the targeted vessels. As the assault craft approached their destination, their clamping arms thrust forward to penetrate the hulls of the cargo ships, each expected to contain supplies of weapons, munitions, and provisions destined for the Traitor Manufactorum outposts and supply orbitals. Melter cutters fired up to finish the work that the Ripping Claws had started, burning access ports through which the warriors of the Shattered Legions boarded. As they did so, their interlinked Vox networks were alive with communications, vital to the conduct of the mission, but also appended with boastful jests between the warriors of mixed providences, who constantly vied to outdo the efforts of each other in the conduct of battle. Warriors who hailed from the 18th voxed remarks about those of the 19th, goading them about their propensity to linger in the shadows of the mighty salamanders, who were ever keen to take the lead in such boarding actions. Retorts were given voice by the Raven Guard troops, who made light of the comparatively clumsy and heavy-handed nature of the salamanders in battle. Such frivolity was rarely shared by the warriors of the 10th Legion, who transmitted only vital strategic data in curt and clipped messages, using disciplined Vox procedures. Despite their obvious rivalries, such division was superficial, and as brothers they fought, each willing to lay down their lives for another, and unerringly respectful of the commanders of their assigned squad leaders, no matter where they hailed from. Meduson himself encouraged such exchanges, despite his cold and calculated mind making him a stranger to the finer points of their humor. He believed it to break the barriers between the legions and allow his warriors to interact in combat with the fluidity and cooperation that would otherwise be hampered. Moreover, it allowed for a brief moment of relief from the crushing grief that every member of the Shattered Legions felt at the losses already suffered in this dark age. A spearhead of salamander breachers blasted a path through the inner void hull layers of their targets, their melter charges punching through the bulkheads, leaving yawning breaches rimmed with molten iron through which they pressed their advance. Their drake-skinned boarding shields held out before them to deflect the salvos of incoming rounds fired from the defenders and their automated sentry weapons. To their rear, a group of Raven Guard Space Marines fanned out, hugging the walls of the internal spaces to use the concealment of their shadows, and meting out short and accurate bursts from their bolters in a consciously selected order, defined by the threat their targets presented. With each chamber cleared of enemies, they once again folded back into formation, ready to repeat the process. Elsewhere, warriors of the Iron Hands deftly overrode the security protocols of the enemy vessels, fooling their systems into parting the vast tooth-locked ceramite slabs that served as doorways between sectors. Coolly and calmly, they progressed through the assigned target levels, their footfalls echoing through the corridors in unison as they marched in lockstep, allowing the foremost warriors in the advance to fall back to the rear of the column when their bolters required reloading. The warriors of other Legion parentage stalled their pace to stay in their position in the marching order of such squads, trusting in the predefined calculations of Ferris's unyielding sons and becoming part of their machine-like operations. Merciless assault. Shattered Legion squads chased small contingents of Sons of Horus through the winding labyrinth of corridors that led deeper into the interior of the cargo hauler in running firefights. Traitors only stopped momentarily to fire short bursts of bolter fire, less aimed and more intended to slow the advance of their pursuers as they ducked through bulkhead doors and hatchways. The Loyalists could not hope to catch the warriors of the 16th as they fell back, their familiarity with the layout of the vessel lending them pace beyond their physical capabilities. To combat this, Meduson's men relied on their technological advantages, deploying disruptive code sequences into the ship's mainframe to control the access ident codes. In doing so, they pinned the traitors against bulkheads that would not open, and the emerald green-clad warriors brought forth flamers to burn the Warmaster's troops where they were trapped. Grimly, the 10th Legion warriors looked on as the sons of Horus burned, sparing their ammunition, whereas the warriors of the 19th doled out single execution shots with their bolt pistols, if only to silence the dying gasps of their enemies. As Meduson's assault teams systematically worked through the ship, they were hampered by the sheer weight of panicked bodies, a horde released from the cargo holds by the sons of Horus in a callous attempt to preserve their own lives. Instead of weapons or supplies, the holds had been filled with thousands of men, women, and children. Now emaciated and encrusted in filth, they had been driven insane by their maltreatment and captivity. Some reduced to shambling wrecks, indifferent to the mayhem that unfolded around them. Others were driven into frenzied rage, unable to decipher the difference between their captors and the warriors of the shattered legions who had come to liberate them. As the loyalist warriors worked to restrain the human cargo that had spilled out from the ship's holds and to understand the reasons behind their presence, their tech marines decoded data manifests that revealed that they had been destined not for the fields of battle as first suspected, but instead for remote locations deep within traitor-held space within the Beta Garmon system. The loyalist raiders found the holds of the ship stripped of all but the bare necessities to support unaugmented life, and littered with the bodies of the dead, numbering as many of those that still clung to life. Meduson showed little emotion as the flood of Vox data was relayed to his command position aboard the Aleph 639. Instead, his mind worked to devise a solution to rescue the survivors extracted from the Warmaster's captivity. So often had retribution and vengeance dominated the objectives of the war they now fought, that rarely did the opportunity to preserve life present itself. Even as he worked, though, his valiant endeavours were shattered by the reality of the war they fought. As contact alerts blared, bathing the command deck in red light, proximity alarms sounded, signalling the presence of approaching enemy vessels. A deadly ambush. A flotilla of Sons of Horus light cruisers tore into real space dangerously close to Meduson's strike fleet, opening fire without mercy. The ships, under the command of Veren Ashurharden, were well-equipped and well-maintained Legion vessels. Their formidable weapons fired with pinpoint accuracy and coordination, destroying the loyalist boarding craft and leaving their assault parties with no reinforcements or means of escape from the cargo haulers they were aboard. The sheer violence of the Sons of Horus assault set Meduson's fleet into disarray, and with malicious intent, Ashurharden's fleet encircled the Aleph 639. Ruthlessly, they positioned themselves to unleash the full force of their weapons batteries, firepower intended not to tactically eliminate the capabilities of Meduson's vessel, but sufficient to overcome its shields in the blink of an eye and simply erase it from existence. The hulls of the Sons of Horus ships shuddered as their weapons charged. Their captains diverted power from their shielding in order to unleash their full strength in a single salvo of overwhelming firepower, intended to spitefully obliterate the Aleph 639 and Meduson himself. A starburst of white light erupted, illuminating the darkness of the void as plasma fire engulfed the hull of a starship. But it was not the Aleph 639 that burned, but instead the Sanctor, the ship that had served under the Sons of Horus. As the explosion faded, the majesty of the Lance of Heaven came into view, its prow-mounted batteries already reloaded and ready to fire on a new target. As the Sons of Horus had ambushed their enemies, so too did the White Scars, the ivory-white hull of the Khan's flagship joined by a trio of mighty battleships, reflecting the dim light of the void as they charged forward in an arrowhead formation. The arrival of such an overwhelming force, although merely a splinter of the 5th Legion's strength that had departed from Terra, was enough to cause the Sons of Horus to flee. Several of the sea-green vessels were split amidships by las beams as they turned about, as the ships under Meduson's command rallied and began to lend their firepower to the battle. With his advantage reasserted by the arrival of the White Scars, Meduson himself, accompanied by a contingent of his most battle-hardened veteran warriors, boarded a stricken vessel bearing the Eye of Horus, keen to make the most of the opportunity that had been presented. The traitor warriors they fought were not the twisted veterans of the Great Crusade, shaped by generations of war, but instead they were inductii, taken from human stock born long after Meduson had walked upon his 100th battlefield. They had all been conscripted from the same world within the Garmon cluster to populate an induction cycle to swell the Warmaster's ranks. Under the command of Ashur-Harden, what the inductii lacked in battle hardening, they made up for in discipline and organization, emulating the hatred the veterans of the 16th Legion possessed for the followers of the Emperor, despite only now meeting them in battle for the first time. They did not fall back or attempt to flee, as their brethren before them had upon the ships filled with human cargo, but instead they stood and fought, unflinching as their squad mates were cut down by shot or blade. Despite their drilled order and coordination, the sons of Horus Inductii did not number enough to match the combined might of Shadrach Meduson with the support of the White Scars. The 5th Legion's vessel drove off the traitor ambushers and formed a hardened cordon, vigilant for enemy reinforcements. With this assistance, the shattered Legion warriors extracted from the enemy vessels they had neutralized to reinforce the ships in which the enemy had put up the most stalwart resistance. Meduson regained control of the battle. The warriors of the shattered legions moved with impunity through the corridors and decks, methodically eliminating the traitors aboard every vessel that had not fled the subsector. The Loyalists took no legionary enemy as prisoner or captive, and instead were motivated by the memory of the suffering inflicted on the human captives they had found aboard Horus's cargo haulers, taking the heads of all who had sworn an oath to the Warmaster without exception. As the din of battle faded, Meduson was hailed by the acting equerry of the Primarch of the 5th Legion, who had summoned the former Ironhad's captain to meet with him aboard the Lance of Heaven. Meduson dutifully responded and boarded the White Scar flagship, accompanied by a combat-ready squad of warriors drawn from numerous legions. Not a retinue or personal guard, but simply those who had completed their resupply routines following the previous engagement. The former Iron Hand's captain had grown estranged from ceremonial proceedings and had become accustomed to a constant and unrelenting state of battle readiness. He carried his own battle panoply about his person, even upon the command deck of the Khan's ship, where he and his warriors were escorted. Before the Khan. As Meduson and his men crossed the threshold of the bridge of the Lance of Heaven, they stood before the Warhawk, who too was garbed in his battle gear, his weapon stowed at the side of the command throne he sat upon. For a moment, Meduson simply stood, momentarily forgetting the procedure or decorum expected when addressing one such as the Primarch of the 5th Legion. As he recalled the proper practice, the former Iron Hand's captain quickly bowed in respect, followed by his company, and Yagatai smiled wryly before inviting them once again to stand at ease. Meduson took the opportunity to offer his gratitude for the intervention of the White Scars and their assistance in defeating the ambush attack. Yagatai accepted Meduson's thanks with the curt and understated modesty of a warrior king, insisting that the customs of Trigoris allowed no other course of action. The Khan informed Meduson of the mission that Rogel Dorne had ordered his legion to complete, and of the presence of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels elsewhere in the Garmon cluster. Presumptuously, in expectation of the former Iron Hand captain's compliance, the Primarch of the 5th Legion outlined the role that Meduson's shattered legions would play as they joined with the White Scar fleet under the overall command of Yagatai. Meduson, ever respectful of the Khan, insisted that his oath-sworn duty in the war that engulfed the galaxy was not yet satisfied, that his path did not lead him to serve under the Khan. To make such a bold statement provoked the ire of the Khan's Keshik Guard, who sprang forward with their power glaives raised, ready to cleave the head from Meduson's body for such an affront to their Primarch's honour. But their killing blows were stayed, as Yagatai rose to his feet and called for them to cease. In the clamour, members of the Keshik shouted indignantly, questioning why Meduson would not accept the honour of fighting alongside the Primarch and the 5th Legion. The Khan stood motionless as a silence enveloped the chamber. The Keshik's gazes remained fixed upon Meduson, who stood immobile at its centre as his men glanced around warily. At Yagatai's command, the defiant captain could be executed for his disrespect, and the Primarch would assume a command of his troops, not out of respect or willing subordination, but out of necessity. This, though, would erode the standing of Yagatai Khan amongst those still loyal to the Imperium, something not worthy of the adoration that Sanguinius bathed in. The Khan's response was utterly quiet as he turned away from Meduson. So be it. The field of nameless dead. From aboard the Lance of Heaven, Yagatai Khan once again led his legions onwards, deeper into the Garmon cluster, descending upon traitor-held positions to unleash their wrath. Augur stations in the deep void had been shattered by the lightning assaults of the 5th Legion, who had annihilated their defences with their ship's prow batteries before launching ferocious boarding actions to seek out and kill the Warmaster's troops without mercy. The Khan delivered the same fate to the defiant traitors at an ice-encrusted supply void terminus, where he personally led an assault to hunt and destroy the corrupted automata constructs that had been reprogrammed to serve Horus. After intercepting the faint echo of a distant beacon, their attentions were drawn towards the Aleph planet, on the system designated officially as 678 Horus Garmon, and known informally as Baron's Landing, a title dating back to the age of the ancestor colony's first forays into that region of space. Militaris records suggested that the planet had been the destination of a solar auxiliar cohort, who had pursued traitor forces of an unknown constitution to that subsector. But the outcome of the action was not known, and the fate of the combatants a mystery. The 5th Legion's splinter fleet, some 50 vessels led out by the Khan himself, approached the system, passing the wrecks of long inactive augur stations and communications relay satellites consigned to dereliction, adrift and slowly decaying. Ever vigilant of a duplicitous ambush by hidden traitor ships, the White Scars maintained a level of high alert, shields powered and with gunnery batteries primed to fire at will. Despite this vigil, no aggressors were detected, and no attack materialized on the approach towards the gravitational well of their objective planet. Even with the imposing form of the Lance of Heaven drawing into high orbit, no response from any defending army was provoked. Efforts to hail forces on the surface of Baron's Landing were met with empty static. A thick atmospheric cloud cover smothered the planet, and several 1,000-kilometer-wide storm fronts generated electromagnetic interference great enough to make blind even the most sophisticated auspexes. As the fleet drew closer, Vox officers reported that efforts to collimate the distress beacon's signal had been successful. The transcripts pulled from the degraded battle data told of an unsuccessful loyalist assault, the survivors collapsing into a defensive line, and a single pocket of surviving troops holding out to the last, besieged by savage warriors that stalked them in the night amongst the fields of their dead enemies. Such tales were of no concern to the Primarch of the 5th, and only served to instigate within him a desire to meet those who instilled such dread in others and slay them in battle. Owing to the turbulent atmospheric conditions and rugged terrain, the Khan's veteran drop force was alone in reaching its designated zone accurately, and mobilized in explorator land raiders, supported by a company of Sky Hunter-riding scimitar jet bikes. Little word of how many other drop companies had deployed successfully reached the Primarch, and a number of companies remained uncommunicable, their Vox channels silent and their troops scattered across that sector of the planet. Those that were reachable had made planetfall so far off course, or beyond mountain ranges or canyons substantial enough that it would take days to traverse, In stillness, though, was death. And so the Khan resolved to proceed towards the site of the distressed beacon, ordering his warriors to mobilize. Engines flared into life, and tracks rolled forward at his command. In convoy formation, the Khan's company made its way across the rocky, unforgiving terrain of Baron's Landing, relentlessly moving towards the objective location. The short-range auger arrays of the lead land raider began to return signals from beyond the crest of a wide, rolling hill that appeared to give way into an expansive hollow. Impetuously, the Khan gave orders for the company to move into line formation and crest the hill at full combat speed, with gunners to engage targets as their guns came to bear. The last survivors. As the formation sped over the summit, grit and exhaust smoke trailed behind the ivory-white vehicles. Target locks flashed red, infantry forces were identified, and as ammunition feeds jerked into life, a Vox broadcast opened up on all channels, prefixed by dated but valid Imperial ident codes, pleading for the White Scars to hold their fire. Each land raider ground to a halt, their tracks juddering across the rough granite surface, and before them stood a figure bearing aloft a tattered banner adorned with faded numerals behind the symbol of the Raptor Imperialis. Several hundred troops in solar-pattern void armor, each a patchwork of field repairs, stood 3 ranks deep at each side. Tentatively, they lowered their las rifles. They were the remnants of the 87th Solar Auxilia Cohort, the Star Reavers, in service of the Emperor, and loyal to Terra. The 87th Cohort of the Solar Auxilia reported having been plagued by continued and harrying attacks by his 16th Legion warriors, whose description correlated with several recorded formations or cadres the Warmaster's own legion was known to employ. The Star Reavers were merely a shadow of their former strength after suffering massive losses, having fought off the predation of traitor forces since the ruin storm had veiled the Garmon cluster. Led by Varsha Daul, who had been promoted directly to the rank of Cohort Marshal from that of Troop Master after the cohort's previous commander had been killed in action. Those that remained of the 87th were hardened survivors, few in number but fierce warriors, dedicated to ensuring the lasting legacy of the Star Reavers was one of bravery and honor, despite the inevitability of the cohort's demise. Marshal Dao pledged her subservience to Yagatai Khan and the White Scars, and joined with his company. The combined Imperial force set about the conduct of the mission as planned, and moved in battle formation towards the source of the distressed beacon. As they drew closer, the meteorological conditions in the region were becalmed, and no battle raged in the region the comm interceptors were traced to. Instead, the forward elements of the force came to a halt at the edge of a vast killing field, once one of the planet's barren plains, now bountiful with the dead. Strewn about in a thick carpet were armored plates, torn from their undersuits with deliberate force, broken rifles and the bodies of countless soldiers, many of which were little more than desiccated skin sacks of fragmentary bone. Great piles of ashen corpses were piled upon the skeletal remains of fallen war walkers and the rusting carcasses of tanks and transport vehicles, all burnt to black in the fire of their own destruction. Duel informed the Khan that this was just one of many battlefields they had encountered upon this world, and the dead had mouldered there before the Star Reavers had even arrived. As the foremost troops of the White Scars company dismounted from a Land Raider Explorator squadron to make their assessment, it became obvious that what had transpired was less of a battle, and more a carnival of destruction wrought by the army that these dead had once constituted. Extreme caution was exercised, and a full spectral sweep of the battlefield was conducted as they advanced. Conscious of the threat of unexploded ordnance or traps hidden beneath the piles of dead, Duel volunteered the Star Reavers to form the forward line of the advance in a demonstration of their ongoing fealty to the Imperium. In response to this request, the Khan saw no reason to deny the cohort's marshal's wishes. As the front line advanced close to the center of the expansive plain, with wreckage and ruins stretching as far as the horizon in all directions, The ground erupted in a cloud of powdered bone and shattered rock as hidden explosives detonated. The front lines of the Star Reavers were shredded by the force of the explosion, cut down by shrapnel and pulverized by the shockwave of overpressure that made a mockery of their comparatively light armor. Even portions of the White Scar's advance suffered similarly, with dismounted troops crushed beneath the mass of a Land Raider flipped over in the blast. The surviving auxiliary troopers struggled to their feet and unearthed each other from beneath the rubble thrown up by the explosion as White Scar's Space Marines strode forward through their lines, their bolt guns leveled on the forms of the enemies suddenly revealed as the blast subsided. Despite the sudden shock of the ambush attack, disciplined and measured bursts of fire were doled out by each legionary as they advanced. Even those injured in the blast, some with limbs hanging limp to their side, or entire panels ripped from their power armor, maintained ordered discipline, knowing their actions were under the watchful eye of their Gene-Sire. White Scar warriors directed their fire at the silhouetted enemies that strode towards them through a wall of fine dust that hung in the air after the initial explosion, as auxiliary sections moved up to lend their volleys of firepower to the fight. Vehicles within the Loyalist lines wheeled about to lend their supportive fire, with heavy bolters hammering in bursts and las cannon spearing fire into the lines of the newly revealed enemy. The Sons of Horus advanced in uniform spacings, firing their bolters in disciplined bursts as they paced towards the Loyalist lines. In the face of the oncoming enemy, Marshal Varshal Duel of the 87th Cohort strode to the fore of her troops and amongst a line of White Scarred legionaries, keen to demonstrate the valor of her troops for the Primarch of the 5th to bear witness. She commanded the Star Reavers' rifle sections to form ranks, the weight of their fire supplementing that of the 5th Legion warriors. Volleys of their las fire cut through the dust-choked atmosphere, but for every shot that found its target, 20 more were deflected by the ceramite plate of the Sons of Horus, leaving the momentum of their advance unbroken. As their enemies drew ever closer, the White Scars slung their bolters and drew blades and chainswords. As one, they cried their battle oaths and ran to counter their attackers. In reply, the Sons of Horus let out a loose chorus of battle cries in reply, their language a broken Chthonian dialect. Warriors clashed at running speed, and the lines of white-armoured loyalists collided into the dust-caked green plate of the Sons of Horus with jarring force. Blades clashed and were stabbed through layers of ceramite, tearing flesh and grating upon bone. With great sweeps of their savage chain axes, the 16th Legion warriors ripped the legs from under their enemies and cleaved down in overhead strikes that smashed through any blade or limb that was offered up to counter or parry the irresistible force of the oncoming blow. They fought with the ferocity and excitement of gangers, gifted the strength of a space marine to wield at will, using artless brutality instead of honed technique, and relishing in the thrill of murder. In the press of a close assault, the White Scars faltered. The Sons of Horus responded to the impact of the countercharge with only more zeal and ferocity, driving the Sons of the Khan back over the ground which they had gained. As they disengaged, the ordered ranks of the Star Reavers resumed their volley fire, deep draining their charge packs as they fired their weapons in blast charger mode into the ranks of the Sons of Horus that had pressed into the fray. Still, though, their enemy came on, too few cut down to stall their advance. Knowing the grim inevitability of their fate, Marshal Duel drew her power sword and ordered her rifle section to fix their bayonets once their ammunition was spent. With a defiant cry, she led the final charge of her company into the teeth of the traitors, an act that invited certain death for the Star Reavers, but one that would buy time for their legionary brethren to consolidate their lines and range their weapons. Despite the tally of the dead that had joined those already lying on the battlefield, mere moments had passed since the ambush on the Loyalist forces had been triggered. Yagatai Khan had raced on foot to reinforce his troops at the first Vox signal, crossing the rugged ground in great bounding strides. He raced to the epicenter of the battle, weaving through the vehicles of the convoy, keen to vent his fury on the traitor attackers, and as they drew closer, the carnage wrought by the Sons of Horus' ambush came into view. Martial duel fought fiercely in the centre of a knot of warriors, desperately sidestepping the crushing blows of several traitors, whilst hacking at them with the single edge of her duelist sword. Within a scrum of warriors, Duel found herself amongst the tightening ranks of her troops, forced together as they tried in vain to evade the deadly strikes of the Space Marines that attacked them. She found an opening to strike as one of the Sons of Horus moved within her reach, her attention hyper-focused on the body of an auxiliary warrior he had hacked at with a gore-spattered chain axe. Duel forced her sword into the warrior's gorget seal with a lunge. Her strike was true, but even as she sunk the tip of her blade into the Space Marine's neck, he fought back against his own death with an animalistic determination. The traitor dropped his own weapons and gripped the polished blade of the elegantly curved sword as he fell to his knees, sputtering blood through the latticed vox grill of his helm as he choked. The marshal tried in vain to pull her weapon free to no avail. Instead, she let go, surrendering it, and turning about in time to see the huge axe blade of another attacker swing down, and with a sickening crunch, she was cleaved from collar to hip by the brutal blow. In witnessing the death of their commander, the remaining Star Reavers lost the will to fight, but no mercy was granted by their attackers as they routed. The Sons of Horus chased them down before they could reach the safety of the White Scar's line. The Khan witnessed the marshal's ignoble death from afar, and with a Chogorian curse bellowed in fury. He renewed his charge, ignoring his warriors' cries on the Vox network, who had intended on using the power of their ranged weapons to thin the ranks of their enemy. The Sons of Horus' ambush had caught the patrol unawares, but with the arrival of their Primarch, their advantage was lost. Yagatai charged headlong, the impact of his momentum smashing several Sons of Horus from their feet, sending them sprawling into their own ranks. With great sweeps of his dao, he split armoured plating and severed limbs with contemptuous ease, filling scores of warriors with each passing heartbeat. Those who attempted to fight were no match for the Warhawk's fury, and those that chose to flee were gunned down by the White Scar's line until the Khan stood alone, surrounded by dust-clad bodies lying motionless on the blood-soaked earth. As the Khan looked to the horizon, though, he saw the attack had been merely the vanguard of a much larger force of Sons of Horus that had now amassed to encircle them. Garmon burns. Those who speak of victory before the foe lies dead are fools. Only once the final blow has been struck does the struggle end. Enred Ha, the Riven Hound. With Yagatai Khan having taken to the field of battle as the exemplar of his legion, the traitor resistance on the planet of Baron's Landing was methodically eradicated by the warriors of the 5th Legion. Despite the disadvantages posed by the rugged terrain, battle-hardened White Scars used their expertise in mobile warfare to scour every hold of enemy presence in an ever-moving kinetic campaign. Sky Hunter squadrons had soared over the craggy terrain to identify enemy positions, providing reconnaissance to direct the precision assaults of their brothers, allowing none to escape their wrath. The heavier vehicles of the Legion had moved relentlessly to smash the walls of their enemies' bastions with irresistible firepower, leaving only fractured rubble and the broken bodies of their inhabitants where their fortifications once stood. This victory had come at the cost of the survivors of the Star Reavers, a solar auxiliary cohort who, in unity, had dutifully sacrificed their lives to honor the Lord of the 5th Legion. The cost of the Khan's forces had also been high, with over 40% of the Legion's war machines that were deployed having been rendered inoperable or irrecoverable by enemy attacks that made use of the hostile terrain to devastating effect. Regardless of the price paid for it, Baron's Landing had no native population or military forces to liberate, and no assets to garrison. Instead, like so many of the worlds that were fought in the fires of the Horus Heresy, it was ruined and left in the wake of the 5th Legion's fleet as they continued their campaign through the Garmon cluster. The White Scars delved ever deeper amidst the chaos of the Great Slaughter, a warfront that had enveloped the region to enact the will of their Primarch. They laid waste to fleets of traitors as they traversed the void and cracked the bedrock of the planets they fell upon to bring death to the enemies of the Imperium. The great battles of the preceding years had given rise to fragmentary warbands and marauding warriors of both allegiances, many drawn in from the surrounding space that still contributed to the growing carnage. Some factions were sent in by the command of their superiors, others arrived by their own volition or drawn in through a sense of duty to aid their allies and vent their hatred upon their common foes. Despite the fact that the Warmaster's campaign had reached a pivotal point, much of the fighting had become motivated by visceral emotion rather than the achievements of any strategic goals. With the war so far having shattered the unity of the Space Marine legions, many pursued the satisfaction of their own objectives as a priority, the vast area of the Garmon cluster providing ample opportunity for such endeavours. The Fangs of the Emperor. Much as Meduson led his campaign against the traitors, so too did Endred Har, at the head of a contingent known as the Fangs of the Emperor, a band of warriors who had erased the heraldry of their parent legions, eschewed their oaths of allegiance to their kin, and who had taken up a new purpose, to satisfy their own desires for revenge before all else. Of Terran birth and a warrior prior even to his induction into the World Eaters, Har himself had been spared the implantation of the Butcher's Nails and segregated from the 12th Legion during their reunion with the Primarch Angron, setting him apart from his brothers even before the Legion had sided with Horus at Istvan. In the wake of the World Eater's treachery, Har had renounced the lineage of Angron and his oaths to the 12th, and had surrounded himself with those who had also done likewise, unlike Meduson's warriors who, united in their loss, had vowed to continue to fight until such a time came when they would be reunited with their own legions. Har's warriors cared not to restore what had once been. Instead, they sought to bring death to Horus through any possible means, and tolerated nothing that waylaid this end, to the extent of turning on and killing those amongst their own who questioned Har's perilous endeavours. Like sharks drawn to blood, the Fangs of the Emperor entered the Garmon cluster seeking the Warmaster, but found instead a vast mire of open war. In order to operate freely from the restraints of the Imperial command, Har's ingress into the cluster was via the eastern sectors, amongst the dead systems far from the cluster's core, making no effort to communicate with any allies in the region, and having little desire to abide by the orders of Terran command. The Fangs of the Emperor stalked the interstellar space, spitefully striking at the enemies they encountered as they searched for any hint of the Warmaster's location, including preying upon the 16th Legion garrisons that watched over mining worlds recently spurred back into action to resupply the traitor armada as it pressed inexorably towards the Sol system. With the pretense of honour long forsaken, Har stopped at nothing to ensure that he could bring his own traitorous brethren and their kind to justice. At the vast munitions caches of the Axioma Pass, a company of Fangs of the Emperor led by Har himself feigned allegiance to the Warmaster, claiming to be the sons of the Red Angel, and still sworn to the body of the 12th Legion. Amidst an atmosphere of heightened suspicion, the company was granted access to the Void Freight docks only after Har had threatened to take the head of the Auxiliary Commandant, or Tura Pin, if he had continued to question Har's loyalties and defy his wishes, a promise Har intended to keep once their vessels were allowed entry. Immediately as the Black Shields were given docking authorizations, their veneer of falsehood was shed, and they set about butchering the auxiliary cohort that stood in defense of the facility, rampaging through the orbital stations in loose packs rather than the highly ordered squads of conventional legions. Although equipped to repel a void ship attack, the defensive batteries and perimeter cordon of the Axioma Pass offered little of their capability in the event of a successful boarding action, and it was left Velataris sections that guarded the munition stores to hold the facility until further aid could arrive. They sealed bulkhead doors and erected makeshift barricades in an attempt to slow the ingress of their attackers, a futile offering of resistance, as Tartarus-plated warriors equipped with chain fists cleaved through them with impunity, and their more lightly armoured brethren followed in their wake. The standard doctrine governing Legion assaults in such situations would call on the use of flamer weapons to purge the tight corridors and confines of such structures. But Ha's men favoured the option of closing with the enemy to make visceral use of shot and blade, regardless of the additional risk factor to their own survival that it posed. In a matter of minutes, the fangs of the Emperor had breached every major sector of the facility and had used the ferocity of their attack to force the defenders onto the back foot. Ha himself led the push into the Void Station, striding through the corridors and walkways of the Axioma Pass Void Station, bellowing the name of Ortura Pin as a challenge, as the last bolts of defensive sentry guns deflected harmlessly from his armour. Those who would attempt to bar his path were swept aside by the wide swings of the Riven Hound's great studded gauntlet as it cracked with barely restrained power. In support, squads of Space Marines, each a warrior who had sworn new allegiance to the fangs of the Emperor, advanced. They wielded familiar weapons, bolt guns and pistols that roared fiery muzzle flashes with each round fired, but also bizarre and esoteric weapons not commonly seen in the hands of the Emperor's legions. From elongated barrels, ridged with cooling fins, and draped with bunches of cabling that appeared to conduct dark energy, these weapons emitted howling blasts of black light that scalded the air and instantly withered living flesh to carbon husks at the slightest touch. The frantic cries of numerous auxiliary sections echoed over the voxnets, and comms address hailers, calling for their comrades to fall back to escape pods and abandon the facility. Pin ordered his closest officers to sever the lines of communication to prevent the dissemination of such messages, and instead reasserted that all under his command should stand and fight, lest they dishonour the name of the Warmaster. Where Pin's men chose to stand, they raised their power axes against the roaring chain blades wielded by the Space Marines, small groups of several soldiers working in concert in an attempt to resist the augmented might of each enemy warrior. Together, they strove to land blows that carved white-hot rents through the ceramite plate of power armor, but only after a great many individual strikes, each that would cost the life of a man, would the incensed Space Marines finally fall. With every sector of the Void Station overrun, and with the chaos of open war his cover, Pin ordered his companion Guardians to fall back to the escape pods and to bar each hatch behind them, stating that any men left behind would be considered an acceptable loss, their deaths earning them the honour of facilitating Pin's survival. As the corridors of the Axioma Pass Void Station ran with blood, and the Black Shields claimed territory in the name of the fangs of the Emperor, Ortura Pin fled, sealing himself with the remaining members of his companion guard within the sanctuary of the facility's escape craft. The vessel, a basic and outdated mark of retrofitted civilian transport shuttle, failed to launch as the auxiliary power systems began to falter, their workings destroyed as the structure rang with the reverberation of explosions. Pin cowered in the darkness behind the remnants of his elite guard. He watched in terror as the immense hand of Endrid Ha inexorably tore through the entrance hatch, ripping away metal in jagged strips. With a final punch, the hatchway was breached, and half a dozen impact-triggered frag grenades were casually tossed through the jagged-edged hole. Pin's troops scrambled for cover, but the combination of explosive fragmentation and overpressure caught those who were too slow to find safety. With indifference to the sporadic defensive fire, those few who survived returned with their lasguns. Ha strode through the breach, casually meting out single shots with his heavy pistol into the surviving auxiliary. He was followed by 2 Space Marines who scanned the gloom with mechanical precision, seeking threats to eliminate. But Ha raised his mighty fist and clenched it in wordless communication, causing them to immediately stop. The escape vessel interior was becalmed, save the last dying groans of Pin's finest men and the snivelling whelps of the Commandant himself as he dragged the blood-soaked ruin of his lower limbs away from the deliberate advance of his attacker. Pin's whimpering grew to a scream as Ha's mighty power-armoured boot stepped down on the shredded remains of his legs, but fell silent as the Riven Hound's blood-soaked fist swung in a hammer blow to crush his skull to paste. With the Axioma Pass cleared of traitor presence, the fangs of the Emperor did not care for the plunder of the caches it held, and instead their minds were turned once more to spite rather than self-perpetuation. Within several of the hangars, Ha's warriors discovered caches of macro shells and immense missiles, undoubtedly destined to rain down upon the loyalist defences in the core of the Garmon cluster. Although their effect would be devastating if directed towards their foe, Ha's fleet ignored their potential for use and instead primed the weapons for detonation, annihilating the Axioma Pass Void Station moments after the fangs of the Emperor had vacated it. Ha's warriors obliterated dozens of orbital stations and supply convoys as they did the Axioma Pass, destroying all they found without consideration for what could be preserved to turn against the Warmaster by those that opposed him. Yagatai Khan first witnessed the shadows of the fire-blackened hulls of the fangs of the Emperor fleet as they fell over the planet of 248 Minoris Garmon, a subsystem behind the Warmaster's line of defense. Here the auxiliary companies of Sons of Horus labored to repair thousands of Legion vehicles, a minute fraction of those committed to the Garmon front, but a number that would serve well in replenishing the losses that the 5th Legion had so far sustained. Row upon row of Deimos-patterned battle tanks sat, many destined for a world known as Deatus. They were repaired and refitted, and awaited the allocation of new crews that were still undergoing the implantation processes that would transform them into space marines. Predators sat, their primary cannon ammunition hoppers filled, and their fuel tanks brimming with promethium. Vindicators, fully laden with their fortress-breaking shells, awaited the thunderous transport ships that would carry them to the heart of battle. And Scorpius artillery vehicles idled, their targeting systems dormant as missiles sat arrayed in their launch tubes. Although now daubed in the colours of the traitor legions, such vehicles had no innate allegiance, and as the wars of the Age of Darkness had aptly demonstrated, could just as easily be turned upon those that wore the same colours as any other weapon could. The Khan had ordered his communication officers to open voxhalers with Ha's warriors as the fangs of the Emperor initiated their attacks. The Primarch wished to issue orders for them to spare the assets of war material that sat on the surface from collateral damage, but his hails went without reply. Uncaring for the preservation of those potential assets, and ignorant to their value to the greater war, the strafing attacks of the harbingers of the fangs of the Emperor's assault descended on trails of fire and rained destruction upon the hangar pods, sending war machines tumbling end over end as explosions billowed amongst them. Fire after squadrons thundered overhead. Tempest rockets loosed from their rails with abandon as Sons of Horus warriors rushed to man the defensive anti-air gun posts in response to lightning-fast attack. As they began to return fire, their positions were assaulted by Ha's troops, who had stormed across the airfields to overwhelm the defenders before their lines could be established. Such assaults were prized by some legions who carried them out with careful orchestration and artful planning. But under the command of Endred Ha, they were driven by little more than impetuous fury, leaving cratered fields littered with ruined hulls, buckled and burning in their wake. The destruction wrought upon the mech yards of 248 Minoris Garmon was total, with naught to be salvaged in the wake of the battle, one which would be regarded as a success from the perspective of Endred Ha, but one that would be considered a senseless waste of vital resources by Yagatai Khan. Enraged by the impetuous and careless acts of the fangs of the Emperor, Khan did not summon Ha before him as he would any other subordinate beneath him in the established chain of command, but instead demanded to be taken to the location of Ha himself. The Warhawk defied. Yagatai's Stormbird descended on roaring retro thrusters amidst the burning debris of hundreds of Legion battle tanks on the surface of 248 Minoris Garmon. As the Khan exited its landing ramp, Ha was striding through the wreckage of the battle, his innermost circle of warriors following in a loose group. Their tarnished armour was slick with the blood of their enemies and crusted with the filth of battle. They laughed callously as they walked, administering execution shots to the wounded sons of Horus troops that were strewn amongst the debris and desecrating the bodies of those that were already dead. The Khan saw not noble warriors of the Imperium in them, but savages who had long forgotten any honour or respect they possessed. Yagatai bellowed the name of Har as a summons even as he approached him, his voice a clarion call across the landscape. Har glanced up in response, breaking his attentions away from his toils with the dead and dying around him. Even before he had the opportunity to greet the Primarch of the 5th Legion, the back of the Khan's gauntlet met the side of the Riven Hound's head in a sweeping blow, knocking him clean from his feet and sprawling through the air several meters to the right, where he landed awkwardly amidst the detritus of battle. Har's men watched aghast, their feet locked to the ground as if in the hold of graphitic clamps. Despite their prowess and skill at arms, they hesitated to strike at Yagatai Khan in retaliation, for none amongst them could move swiftly enough to even take a step before the Primarch would strike them down with a deadly blow. They looked on as their leader spat congealed gobbets of his own blood, the force of the Khan's blow having caused several injuries to face and jaw that would have been sufficient to kill an unaugmented warrior. He hauled himself up onto a knee as a Warhawk towered over him. When Har had been admonished in such a manner by lesser warriors than the Khan, his supposed superiors from within the 12th Legion, he had responded with an uppercut punch, driven with the force of both arms and legs, or a feigned blow to buy time to deliver a volley from his sidearm at point-blank range. Either attempt to strike the Warhawk in anger would be a death sentence, and one that he would only prepare to serve as a result of an attempt on Horus's life. Instead, each warrior remained still as an uneasy silence descended. Only moments passed before each stretched to the span of an age before the Khan's voice, like the thunder that heralds the coming of a storm, finally broke the silence. He told Har of the disgust he felt that his personal vendetta had led to the squandering of so much that could have been of value to the 5th Legion. He chastised the former World-Eater for his ignorance and inability to perceive the wider situation and of the perilous balance that the fate of Terra and of humanity found itself in. Scornfully he admitted, though, he did not expect any more from those of the lineage of Angron, the most feral and indignant of those amongst his kin. The Khan watched intently as he saw the fury boil behind the eyes of Endred Har, the weight of his anger building like water behind a dam, until finally his restraint failed. Har sprang to his feet with an explosive release of tension, his massive fist swinging in a wide arc, driven not by skill but by incandescent rage. Yagatai had predicted such an outburst of emotion, leading to such an inelegant and poorly balanced attempt to strike him down. With a deft half-step to the side, the Warhawk avoided Har's clumsy attack and crouched to sweep his own leg in a tight circle that entangled Endred's feet as he passed, knocking them out from under him and once again causing him to land in an awkward heap. Making no effort to draw his own weapon or instigate an attack himself, the Khan watched Har with a sideways stare as he hauled himself to his feet again and began to circle slowly, his frustration manifesting in his posture as he tensed and released the grip of his fists. The fangs of the Emperor that accompanied Har stood motionless as spectators, knowing better than to intervene in matters of honor, and also reluctant to seal their own deaths by attacking the Warhawk himself. Har's restraint once again slipped, and he broke into a charge directly towards Yagatai, throwing the mass of his body in an ungainly attempt at a tackle. Once more, the Khan predicted Har's actions, and in the blink of an eye had clinched him in a grapple, throwing him over his shoulder and using Har's momentum to slam him into the ground on his back. Before Har had even recovered from the force of the blow, Yagatai had drawn his sword, and its tip was pointed directly at Har's throat as he lay on his back. With the Riven Hound at his mercy, Yagatai muted his tone and spoke closely to the warrior he held captive, casually informing him that, as a consequence of his actions, he would be relieved of the command of his men. Their fighting strength would be reassigned under the control of the Khan, where they would fight at the will of the 5th Legion. The notion of such a thing caused Har to scoff involuntarily, an act that provoked the Khan to drive the tip of his blade ever closer to his throat. With his voice a breathy rasp, as the tip of the Warhawk's blade threatened to cut into the flesh of his neck, Har whispered, "You will fail in your endeavour, Warhawk, unless you heed me now. I know more of the Garmon cluster than you would suppose." Assault on Deatus. The hull of the Lance of Heaven blazed with heat as it flew into the atmosphere of Deatus, followed by the vessels of the 5th Legion Retribution Fleet in a tight formation, disgorging drop pods and landing ships as a massed planetary assault. There was no other herald of Yagatai Khan's arrival, no opportunity to offer a surrender, nor enter into a process of diplomacy. Only the might of the White Scars unleashed to attack at their Primarch's command. No sooner had the first assault craft of the 5th Legion broken the low cloud cover of the brooding skies, came the reaction of the traitor army that inhabited Deatus. They replied in kind, with unrelenting barrages of weapons fire directed towards the invaders. Macro cannon and las batteries emplaced within great fortifications turned skywards as they tracked the trajectories of the loyalist ships, crisscrossing the skies with red-orange incandescence. The sons of Horus sent squadrons of Xiphon interceptor craft soaring in near vertical climbs, their afterburners trailing fire as they accelerated. They raced to meet the larger, less maneuverable dropships as they descended, packs of hungry wolves snapping at the ankles of herd beasts. They harried their chosen prey with strafing cannon fire, damaging thrusters and wings, sending the larger craft tumbling without control through the lattice of contrails that webbed the sky. Thousands of loyalist troops were lost when their transports crashed or were obliterated by direct hits from the potent guns of the traitor defense. But for each that was lost, another ran the gauntlet of fire to reach the ground. Despite the remote location of their garrison upon Deatus, set apart from the well-travelled routes of the Garmon cluster, Varen Ashurdan's sons of Horus had maintained a constant state of vigilance, maintaining their battle readiness and alertness at all times. No amount of preparation could repel the onslaught of the White Scars, though. Their landing craft and dropships filled the skies above the long-forgotten world, darkening the light of the day as they deployed the full force of their legion. The initial waves of loyalists paid a high price for conducting such a bold and direct assault on the traitor positions as they charged directly at the enemy's guns. This was the way of warfare Yagatai Khan had instilled in his sons, opting to harness the shock and awe of a rapid assault instead of a time-consuming preparatory bombardment and escalation of force. The massed assault plunged the entire planet into a war that encompassed every ancient city across every desolate continent, without a single word exchanged between the generals of either side. The equatorial wastelands became the site of massive battles in which the treads of thousands of tanks crushed the remains of the planet's ancient civilizations, raising clouds of dust and ash high into the atmosphere. White Scars assault companies targeted the temperate jungle regions of the planet, stalking through the dense vegetation to silence outposts and remote silos from which the traitors launched missile strikes on loyalist locations. Armored columns of sea-green Kratos tanks, flanked by scores of infantry, rolled from within the subterranean hangars of long-abandoned manufactorum's facilities to meet and oppose the waves of ivory-white grav skimmers, jet bikes and land speeders that ran at the vanguard of the White Scars assault. Entire Civitas blocks erupted in vicious room-to-room fighting as companies of the Khan's troops and their allies performed aerial drops, landing on the highest rooftops to fight floor by floor through the defenders down to the ground. Ashurdan's men had repurposed the dilapidated structures of Deatus's ancient settlements to meet their requirements, turning ruined habitation settlements into barracks houses, and armories and agri-sectors into launch pads and ammunition caches. These locations became the epicenters of great battles, where the White Scars attempted to eliminate the infrastructure behind the traitors' defense. In truth, all but one of these assaults by the White Scars was a feign, intended to misdirect the strength of the traitors. It was not blindly or by chance that the 5th Legion had happened across Deatus, and it was not out of fury or vengeful rage that Yagatai had ordered the assault of the planet. Instead, his actions were guided by the information extracted from Endred Har. Under duress, the former World Eater had confessed that, during his own campaign through the Garmon Cluster, it had been revealed to him that the sons of Horus had amassed upon Deatus. Gathered to them reinforcements from the Beta Garmon system and allies from many of the traitor legions and other factions that had aligned with the Warmaster. Together they had claimed the entire planet as their own and repurposed the primitive structures of long-dead civilizations, draping them with banners that bore the sigil of the Warmaster. Where many of these structures were utilized as military installations necessary to supply the vast traitor armies with key resources, fuel and ammunition, one location given the name of Gal Zamad, roughly God's throne, in a particular Chthonian dialect, had a far more sinister purpose. Endred Har had intended to travel to Deatus to find this place where, it was told to him, Horus himself would seek to perform a ritual, a communion with his dark patrons that would further the ascension of his maligned powers. Yagatai, although suspicious of this revelation, had harried the Warmaster's forces ceaselessly, but knew that the White Scars campaign, no matter how impactful, would ever be cast into shadow by the glorious endeavors of the Great Angel. The victories the White Scars had enjoyed were merely peripheral, and in the greater scheme, ones that would not impact the course of history. Even if it defied Dorne's instructions to seek neither revenge nor personal glory, the Khan could not ignore such an opportunity, and in successfully pursuing it, he would be able to change the course of the Horus Heresy. The Khan's victory could waylay the Warmaster's return to Terra, and in turn contribute more to the preservation of the Imperium than the work of any other. In admonishment for his impetuous campaign of wanton destruction, the Khan had ordered Endred Har to instead lead his fangs of the Emperor elsewhere within the Garmon Cluster, to the Beta Garmon system, leaving the prize of the hunt of the Warmaster to himself and the 5th Legion. Before their departure, though, the Warhawk swore that should Har's recountings be revealed as false, or should he disobey the Primarch's will, then he would once again feel the bite of the white tiger Dao upon his throat, and it would be the last sensation he would ever experience. The very presence of the traitor forces at Deatus had told Yagatai that at least some of Har's story had been true, but in a time of such deceit and betrayal, there ever remained the possibility of a ruse or a misrepresentation of truth intended to drive the 5th Legion into a baited trap within which their peril awaited them. While the White Scars committed a full-scale attack and locked with traitor forces, there was no time for doubt, and should Har's words prove to be naught more than falsehood, there would be no honor in recalling the Legion. The Traitor's Lair. Upon their arrival, no scouting parties had been necessary to validate the words that the Khan had been told. The structure of the Gal Zamad, though obscured by the thick cloud cover that enveloped the planet, was visible to multispectral augurs of every vessel in the fleet. Set within an octagonal perimeter of concentric curtain walls that had existed since before Imperial records began, unmistakably the architecture of some lost civilization, the Gal Zamad was a plateau-topped pyramid formed from cut stone, each the size of a Munitorum container. Although formidable as a position to assail, the original architects of the structure had clearly intended some grander purpose, more akin to the legendary constructs of pre-industrial Terra, a time when the gods of old had supposedly walked the earth. The Gal Zamad bore the characteristics of a place that formed not only the center of a civilization, but also acted as a monument to faith, a place where life and death were intertwined, a place of creation and of ending, a gateway between one realm of existence and another. Horus and his followers had not revered or respected this place as those who had built it, although it was impossible to know if those who came before would have considered the labors of the 16th Legion to constitute desecration. To augment the defenses, shield generators and gun emplacements had been recently added by the Warmaster's engineers within sprawling fields of dragon's teeth and tank traps. They had created a new monument from the Galzamad. They had made it a temple to conquest and dominion, but one that, at its core, would still play host to some ritual of arcane significance. The traitor's stronghold was an affront to the purity of the Imperium, and that the blasphemous ancient structure stood at its heart incensed the Warhawk. At the fore of his legion, the Primarch's company focused the main strength of their assault on the Galzamad, while screening forces of indentured loyalist troops and solar auxiliary cohorts were deployed to contain and occupy the enemies stationed within the lesser fortifications to prevent them from harassing the main assault. A formation of 5th Legion Terminators advanced upon the Galzamad, forced to entrust their survival to their Cataphractii Terminator plate. The narrowness of the defences prevented them being delivered into the battle by Spartan assault tanks. Across open ground the warriors marched, unrelenting in their pace, even as brothers amongst their number fell to the torrent of defensive fire and explosions rippling through their ranks. Less than half of the warriors that set out to cross the deadly open ground surrounding the fortress reached their objective. The rest were slain during their advance, a loss deemed acceptable according to the Principia Bellicosa and its teachings on the conduct of siege warfare. Those that remained set about breaching and disabling the networked gun emplacements around Galzamad and bringing down the void aegis that shielded it from direct assault. With roaring chain fists they carved through the plasteel bulkhead hatches and burned out the enemy gunners with their heavy flamers, igniting the ammunition in the magazine of each position they went. Detonations erupted as the ebon-armoured Terminators of the 5th Legion enacted the rites of the Karash, and one by one silenced the defenders' guns, working relentlessly towards the generators within the walls of the fortress. With the coverage of the enemy's interceptor fire reduced, the White Scars were able to land greater numbers of troops safely and moved quickly to amass their forces and besiege the enemy position. But even with many of the traitor guns silenced, they were not unopposed. Wild, ravaging packs of World Eaters charged from Port Cutlass gates in the wars as outriders, too filled with bloodlust and fury to stand behind their defences and wait for their attackers to come forth. Although with numbers enough to form companies, the 12th Legion warriors fought no longer with the organisation of a legion force, but moved in loose bands and recognized no central command elements, instead relying on an instinctive desire to move forward and tear their foes limb from limb to guide them. They disembarked from their vehicles and rushed forward on foot when their drivers had to slow down to manoeuvre between the angular ferrocrete defences to avoid collision. The World Eaters were not the only warriors intent on closing with the enemy line rapidly, and a Zhao formation of 5th Legion warriors dropped from the heavy clouds that hung over Galzamad, having departed their dropships high above to shield the Terminator squads that worked to systematically disable the defences. The great Khan himself rode at the fore, his battle cries audible over even the roaring jets of his Sojutsu pattern void bike, as they tore at full speed towards the traitor line. Where the sight of a Primarch such as Yagatai would have caused other warriors to balk or even rout, the effect on the 12th Legion was the inverse, and their champions tightened their chain bindings of their weapons and clamoured over their own troops to bellow challenges to the Lord of the 5th Legion, eager to prove themselves worthy in personal combat, as was the custom of their heritage. Yagatai sought only to test himself in combat with the Warmaster himself, but if those aspirant warriors were so keen to cross his path, he was prepared to gladly deliver unto them the death they so desired. Flanking the arrowhead column as they closed on the World Eaters' line below them were Javelin and Kaizagan landspeeders, who rained fire on the 12th Legion warriors from afar, strafing along their disordered lines with a hail of solid shot and shredding fragmentary missiles, cutting their legs from beneath the World Eaters as they charged. This was not the true strength of the Zhao assault, but merely a preparatory bombardment, as Yagatai and the 5th Legion warriors continued their meteoric descent towards the enemy line, weaving and dodging to avoid the sporadic gunfire of the World Eaters, before finally unsheathing their blades and Kontos power lances to charge the enemy line at full speed. The force of the impact sent a thundering shockwave through the atmosphere as the explosive discharges of power lances pierced the ceramide armor of both warriors and war machines alike, pulverizing the flesh of the bodies within. Lesser warriors would have turned and fled, but the World Eaters were undeterred by the ferocity of the charge and sought to tear White Scar riders from their saddles with their bare hands as they passed and hacked with grinding chain axes to bring their opponents low. Yagatai leapt from his mount and emptied a single shot from each chamber of Storm's voice, his artifice sidearm, into the central mass of 6 World Eaters, the impact punching them clean from their feet, and had reholstered it before the bodies of his enemies hit the ground. The elegantly curved white tiger dao blade sang as Yagatai carved arcs from left to right, right to left, cleaving his enemies at the midriff with each pass. First came one would-be champion of the 12th Legion, roaring and frothing from the breather grill of his helm as he swung the weight of a massive chain blade in a competent yet predictable manner. The Khan had decided on how this opponent would die even as he advanced, the traitor's rage and bluster no match for the swordsmanship of the Primarch. He spun away from the World Eater's blows and reversed his grip of his weapon, thrusting it through the back of his opponent as the momentum of a misplaced blow carried the World Eater past. Next came 2, chained together, left arm to right, as part of some barbaric gladiatorial ritual, each wielding weapons fashioned in the shape of the tools of ancient hunters in their free hands. For a fraction of a second, the Primarch hesitated, a period of time imperceptible to mere humans, but a moment long enough for Yagatai to delay and take in the spectacle of a pair of warriors fighting in such a manner. The moment passed, a period less than the blink of an eye, and the Khan struck, beheading them as one with a single sweep. With the momentum of the initial charge spent, a grinding melee ensued before the walls of the fortification as more warriors committed to the fight. White Scars borne aloft on Warhawk jump packs reinforced the line first, with additional squads of warriors following on foot. Scorpius artillery batteries were brought forward from the landing sites within range of the traitor's walls. They unleashed a relentless barrage upon the defenders, whilst land speeders and jet bike squadrons continued their strafing runs, shielding the Khan from the focused firepower of the 16th Legion warriors atop the massive battlements of the ancient fortress. The sun of Deatus set and rose again, as a blood-red orb before the fury of the World Eaters was finally extinguished by the unremitting determination of the 5th Legion. Thousands had died during a single night of carnage, but what remained of Yagatai's loyal sons now stood before the gates of Galzamad as they were broken open. The venerable 5th Legion Mastodon, Atlasa, itself a relic of the Great Crusade, had been sacrificed to breach the gates. Even in its machine death, the massive vehicle's stricken hull provided an armoured conduit through which the White Scars could make their ingress into the inner fortress. The Atlasa's crew drained the dying throes of its reactor's output to fuel searing blasts from its siege melter array, burning a path through the throngs of Sons of Horus that rushed to fill the breach, reducing armour and flesh to ash. Yagatai Khan emerged from the gloomy interior of the stricken mastodon, treading the fire-scoured path before him, followed closely by a score of Ebon Keshig Terminators wielding glaives sheathed in crackling power fields. Each of them was wearied by the preceding hours of battle, but sustained by not only their transhuman physiologies, but also their burning hatred for their duplicitous brethren. Sons of Horus amassed upon the steps of the central pyramid, emerging from subterranean bunkers and silos to bring their weaponry to bear. They unleashed volleys of bolt round and incendiary blasts of plasma that cut through the ranks of the White Scars as they fanned out from the breach to press a fresh assault. Even as White Scars poured from the breach, they were forced to fight across open ground to reach the steep, stepped sides of the pyramid, and paid a toll in spilled blood for every step forward. Over the bodies of his fallen sons, the Khan climbed in search of Horus, each having sold their lives only after sending many times their own number of traitor legionaries tumbling down to the ground. At last, he reached the plateau atop the Galzamad, and those that remained of his company drove the blades through the throats of the few enemies that still defied death around them. At the foot of the pyramid far below, battle still raged, as traitor warriors in the sea green of the 16th were joined by those clad in the royal violet of the 3rd and the deep crimson of the 17th to repel the White Scars. A fog as thick as oil smoke began to coalesce, blocking the Khan's view, with his view of the battle beneath him obscured. Yagatai's sight was drawn to the presence that moved in the haze before him. It was at first an indistinct silhouette in the distance, but as the figure strode closer, the vision became clearer. Horus Lupercal was finally before him. The Warmaster was not alone on the plateau of the Gals of Mad, as dozens of the elite of the 16th Legion prowled closer, the golden cast skulls of their former foes hanging from the chains of their baroque spiked armor, and the eye lenses of their fire-blackened helms glowing like embers in the dark. Behind them, a hunched figure with all the trappings of a space marine bore his weight upon a staff topped with a brazen rendering of the Eye of Horus. The Khan glanced about him. His companions instinctively raised their power glaives and formed around him in a protective circle. But he had no intention of fighting defensively. Instead, immediately breaking into a charge directly towards Horus himself. Yagatai struck out at Horus with the force of a hurricane, a storm of fury and vengeance unleashed against the arch-traitor. The Khan's faithful company of Ebon Kishig fought at his side, each a warrior of exemplary discipline and skill, pitted against the brute force and resilience of the elite warriors that accompanied the Warmaster. The blade mastery and fervour of the White Scars would have been sufficient to best almost any other warriors, but they had found their equal in Horus and his servants. Where his warriors fought as slavering monsters that revelled in slaughter, Horus fought impassively, his gaze ever fixed at some point beyond Yagatai. He moved to counter each of the Khan's blows with premonitory intuition, maintaining an imperious guard against his deadly sword strikes. The blade of the white tiger Dao skittering from the haft of Worldbreaker in showers of white-hot sparks with each pass. Even with the preternatural stamina of a Primarch, Yagatai began to tire, but the Warmaster's strength was unwavering. Like a mountain of granite, he remained unmoved before the flurry of blows that the Khan unleashed. Evidently, the ritual he had come to Deatus to conduct was already complete, and his physical form already bestowed with the eightfold blessings of his malevolent benefactors. Horus's capabilities were now something beyond those he had been created with. He was enhanced. He had ascended. With a dismissive forward kick to Yagatai's chest, he sent the Warhawk sprawling backwards where he landed amongst a heap of his own sons, all of them dead, their armour torn through by blade and claw, and their bodies now twisted, crumpled wrecks. Sons of Horus spat guttural Chthonian slurs as they prowled around him, but Horus held them at bay with a subtle gesture of his hand as he loomed over the Khan, who lay prone, breathing heavily with the exertion of battle. Yagatai awaited the coming of a killing blow as the Warmaster raised his enormous spiked mace. But before it was delivered, Horus hesitated, as if reminded of some greater purpose, an eventuality that would yet come to pass. Yagatai searched the face of his brother and looked deep into his eyes, now black and bottomless pits. No kin of his resided within that physical form any longer. Something hateful and malevolent had taken it as its own. Above, as Horus was poised to deliver his brother's end, fire wreathed the skies of Deatus, not of some celestial phenomena, but the burning ruin of Legion warships, far too many of them bearing the heraldry of the 5th Legion. The blinkered focus of the Khan's assault upon the world had placed his fleet in peril, and as the sons of Horus were reinforced, fresh vessels under the command of Tybalt Ma had moved in response to the attacks. With the overwhelming majority of his warriors committed to support the ground assault, the Khan's fleet had resisted the counterattack of the sons of Horus, who had arrived from their stations within the subsector, but in the face of such overwhelming enemy forces, defeat was imminent. The Lance of Heaven itself and many other ships of the White Scars had come perilously close to being overrun, their crews' vox hails for assistance unheard by the Khan or any other, as if they had been silenced by some unseen corruption. The invaders upon the 5th Legion flagship were driven off through the intervention of Meduson's shattered legions, warriors in Ebon, Emerald and Iron Grey who had arrived, drawn in pursuit of Tybalt Mar, unannounced but welcomed by the White Scars, to purge the traitorous presence. Shadrach Meduson himself had boarded the Khan's ship and fought to clear the bridge of enemies, his troops securing it at the cost of many lives. Amongst Meduson's men who also hailed from the 10th Legion, some had elevated the practice of vox encoding and communication beyond that of standard legionary training. These Space Marines plied their mysterious skills to bypass the obfuscating PAL in their vox networks and re-establish communications with the troops on the surface of Deatus. For their intervention, the White Scars gave their gratitude to Meduson and his warriors, although their efforts had revealed a dire situation, one of imminent loyalist defeat and the Primarch of the 5th himself in peril. With the primary system of the vessel once again under their control, the Shattered Legions and the White Scars worked in concert. Meduson was informed that although his tech marines were successfully able to fix the location of Yagatai Khan upon the surface of Deatus, the extraction of the Warhawk to relative safety by means of standard teleportation, the equipment that the warriors of the 5th Legion were familiar with, would have been impossible. The enhanced and experimental technological artifacts that the warriors of the Shattered Legions had in their possession had far greater capabilities, including that of much more accurate and powerful teleportation, although in many cases were untested and their use had unforeseen consequences. Despite the dire risks, Meduson was pressed to make a choice, for without his intervention the Warhawk would fall before Horus, the effect of which would damn the defense of Terra to almost certain failure. At his command, Meduson's men had initiated the mechanisms of technology the likes of which existed nowhere else within the Imperium, and opened a rift through physical space, allowing them to reach to the surface of Deatus and deliver Yagatai Khan from within the grasp of the Warmaster. The Warmaster towered over Yagatai as he struggled to stand, his limbs giving way under his own weight, as if stricken by some debilitating malady that radiated from Horus. As the Khan had finally accepted the imminence of his own end, a blinding flash of white light erupted around him, the miniature supernovae of a teleportation flare. When the whiteout faded, Yagatai was gone, leaving Horus on the plateau surrounded by the scenes of butchery he and his warriors had wrought. But there were no screams of fury at the theft of his triumph over the Khan. Instead, an aura of cold detachment settled over the arch-traitor. War in the shadows. The hell of the ancients has surely been filled, for now the damned are amongst us. Ancient Terran proverb. Yagatai Khan rapidly recovered from the shock of sudden teleportation, his enhanced mental and physical resilience proofing him against the trauma of the process far more effectively than that of any Space Marine. He was, however, still rendered insensate for a short period, a side effect of the mysterious technology employed to deliver him once again to the bridge of the Lance of Heaven. During his recovery, much of the surviving Loyalist fleet had escaped from the proximity of Deatus and made way for the near void in a hasty and disorganized disengagement. As the Primarch was roused, he brushed away the attention of the Legion's serfs, who clamoured to tend to his wounds and the rents in his armour, surrounded by the cacophony of battle communications that still screamed across the Vox network. Meduson had watched over him in vigil since the teleportation had been completed, and took to a knee in respect as the Primarch regained his bearings. The Space Marine bowed, and for a brief moment Yagatai Khan regarded him as his prodigious mind rebuilt an eidetic recollection of events, before placing his hand upon the former Iron Hand's pauldron, willing him to rise up once again to his feet. The Khan did not chastise Meduson for his intervention, nor did he thank him, for there was little time for sentiment. Instead, he asked to be appraised of the strategic overview of the battle fleet. Initially, The bridge crew began to relay the list of battle companies and their remaining strengths. The Khan ordered them to cease, asking simply what had survived. Hesitantly, a lowly adept announced that losses were estimated to be in the region of 47%, and detailed how extraction ships had flown hundreds of sorties under heavy fire to ferry troops back into orbit until the fleet was forced to break away from anchor. Much had been lost, and many remained unaccounted for. Despite the option to retreat from the surface of the planet, far fewer White Scars were extracted than had been part of the initial planetfall. Not only had the losses during the fighting been great, but also many had refused to leave, instead opting to continue fighting stubbornly to hold back the tide of traitors that would give chase to the escaping loyalist fleet. Yagatai remained silent, locked in introspection for only a moment before he spoke. He bade that those who had remained on Deatus should not be mourned, for they were not lost, but instead that fate had set them on a separate course. He spoke of the assurance he had that their paths would cross again, if only they found the resolve to continue to fight. As the 5th Legion fleet, now joined by vessels under the command of Shadrach Medusan, continued on its course away from Deatus, its personnel began to reorganize and recover from their rapid departure. Amidst the toils of repair and the restoration of order throughout the decks, Medusan himself remained upon the Lance of Heaven alongside Yagatai Khan. The two sequestered away from the labouring crew and staff, and was extended the honour of accompanying the Khan within the Primarch's private quarters. Together, they communicated openly of the war within the Garmon cluster, sharing their own concerns and aspirations as Yagatai emulated the mannerisms of Sanguinius, offering not only inquiries of his comrade, but also listening intently as he spoke. Medusan suggested that a valid contribution to the war effort may still be made if only a victory could be claimed at Beta Garmon, a comment that the Khan considered intently. Under Medusan's command, his shattered legions had waged a disruptive campaign of targeted attacks on the traitor's logistical framework, the gears that drove the war and undermined the Warmaster's foothold within the Garmon cluster. Much as they had strived to do since the atrocities at Istvan had riven their legions apart. Inevitably, Medusan knew the Leviathan's gaze would shift, and the might of the Warmaster's forces would be focused upon those who sought to destabilize the mechanisms by which they waged Horus's war, and this was an unavoidable consequence of his actions. The shattered legions were forced to claim victory not over vast armies upon grand war fronts that spanned entire continents, nor would they march triumphant at the fore of grand hosts of celebrated warriors. Instead, their wars would be fought in the darkness, in the shadowed regions where the golden light of glory did not shine, and through the perpetration of acts that few would ever speak of. In this, Yagatai saw the parallels between Medusan's legion and his own in the war for the Garmon cluster. These victories would not be won over the Warmaster himself, nor would the conquest of the core systems be listed amongst their accomplishments, but without their contribution, nor could they be won by Sanguinius. The 5th Legion had suffered defeat at the hands of the sons of Horus at Deatus, and without the intervention of Shadrach Medusan, the Khan's hubris would have led to his ending at the hands of the Warmaster. The strength and skill of Horus had always been amongst the greatest of their brotherhood, but now he had been enhanced, somehow imbued with ever more power and speed. Where that battle had been lost, though, the greater war may still be won. Medusan told the Khan of the gene forges of Beta Garmon, one of several places his scouting vessels had witnessed from afar, facilities under the control of the 16th Legion that provided a seemingly endless stream of reinforcements with which Horus enforced his reign over much of the Garmon cluster and fed the battlefields of the core systems. Although this region was far from the Beta Garmon system and the capital of the cluster itself, to prevent its supply of troops would starve the traitors of reinforcements in the core systems and had the potential to swing the balance of the wider war in Sanguinius' favor. Instead of striking at the supply convoys of the Warmaster's campaign, they would strike at its heart. When Yagatai and Medusan emerged from their seclusion aboard the Lance of Heaven, they did so with new clarity of purpose and vigour. Together they stood as the Khan gave the address to his fleet and set course to Beta Garmon. The tide of devastation. The Beta Garmon system itself had been sheltered from the rigours of war. The tide of devastation had not reached it, and from its worlds a stream of Space Marine inductii had issued forth as reinforcements for the 16th Legion. Vast numbers of enemy troops were produced by gene forges constructed at numerous locations across the system and fed with human stock, originally sourced from the populace of Beta Garmon's penal colonies. When those populations had been exhausted, fresh candidates, extracted from systems throughout the Garmon cluster, were shipped in aboard the Warmaster's Black Arks. When the Lance of Heaven broached the system under the steerage of Yagatai Khan, it became clear that they were not the first to attack Beta Garmon, and instead it was already embroiled in open warfare. Before the Loyalist fleet, battle raged as the distance between immense voidcraft was closed, with reckless speed and endless rafts of boarding torpedoes sped between the lines. The ravaged hulls of ships from both factions listed lifelessly, their passengers and crews spilled into the void and already long dead. They beheld not the crimson majesty of the 9th Legion arrayed, but instead the scoured and blackened hulls of the myriad ships of the Fangs of the Emperor engaged throughout the system. Yagatai saw that this was where Endred Ha had ventured to vent his fury upon the enemy, and his features hardened as his crew began to assess the state of the battle before them. And following standard Legion protocols by attempting to make contact with the ships that assailed the traitor positions. Sternly he called for them to cease, ordering that no attempted communication with Endred Ha or any of his followers should be made. In his wisdom, the Khan knew better than to attempt to restrain Ha's intentions with any pretense of strategy or coordination. The Riven Hound spoke only the language of war, and any attempts to suggest the utilization of a complex strategy or install a hierarchy of command would fall upon deaf ears. But worse still, he knew that Ha would ask questions of the success of their actions upon Deatus. These were things that Yagatai Khan did not wish to speak of. Instead, the Warhawk commanded his crews to make communication with Medusan and his vessels. They were to join the attack alongside the Fangs of the Emperor. Where Ha had charged headlong into battle, the traitors had risen up in response and gained the upper hand, as the initial shock assault had bled off its momentum. Although merely the garrison force of a system that languished far from the crucible of the war, the traitors that remained within the Beta Garmon system were well placed to defend their territory, and were able to fight with the ferocity of a force many times their true number. The Khan intended to be the hammer that would smash the traitor force, to triumph over the Warmaster's troops and deliver the Fangs of the Emperor from their inevitable destruction. Vindication through victory. The disposition of Ha's forces was the evidence of a one-dimensional attack, one that Yagatai Khan considered ill-conceived and destined for failure, but which was characteristic of the perpetrators. The evident lack of counter-contingency and depth of strategy employed by the Fangs of the Emperor would have caused the Warhawk dismay had they been the conduct of any other faction. Instead, the Khan was buoyed by the opportunity to intervene as he rapidly directed his sub-commanders and company captains via Vox as he made his way to his own Stormbird. He paced through the corridors of the Lance of Heaven in strides 3 times the length of that of his adjutants, causing them to run to keep pace as they relayed critical battle data. The Khan was informed that, initially, Ha's forces had attempted to form a semblance of a blockade of the traitor forces at Beta Garmon 2, their ships ringing the high orbit of the planet, but the besieging fleet had not the numbers to maintain their cordon, and their lines were now perilously close to being overrun by the sons of Horus that sallied forth from their encampments in defiance. The Khan showed little interest in the sub-theatre of the conflict, and suggested that Medusan may wish to direct his forces there. He gestured for the adjutant to continue. In the crystalline asteroid belts between Beta Garmon 5 and 6, the traitors maintained an iron hold of their territory, resisting and repelling the fangs of the Emperor's every attempt to gain a foothold, leaving the sundered hulls adrift amongst the barren rocks. A bloody war of attrition had set in there, and would not be decisively concluded while the surrounding territories remained contested. This too disinterested the Khan, and he impatiently ordered for the adjutant to proceed. Another human subject shuffled through datasates clumsily and began to relay information regarding Beta Garmon 10, where the main strength of the traitor defense was gathered. There, the ship Ha had most recently commandeered, the Balthansa, along with a number of other ships of comparable tonnage, were completing the final stages of an orbital drop. Yagatai's eyes widened and his pace quickened ever more. He would strike here, at Beta Garmon 10. He would make his mark upon the Garmon cluster. Even as the last landers and drop pods of the fangs of the Emperor were expelled from their flight decks above Beta Garmon 10, the hulls of the vessels that had delivered them began to slew away in cataclysmic explosions. The void shields that had protected them finally succumbing to the relentless barrage of fire that they had been forced to endure. They had flown too close to the surface of the planet, their pilots as impetuous and reckless as their leader, and had been trapped, inescapably, within the gravity well of Beta Garmon 10. The Khan's strike force threaded through the burning wreckage that began to tumble towards the surface, like meteors of adamantine and iron. Squadrons of ivory-white stormbirds carried companies of elite warriors, flanked by scores of smaller craft that reflected the red-orange light of explosions, causing them to glitter like jewels against a backdrop of smouldering umber. Yagatai had shed the flight restraints of his drop cradle and stood amongst the warriors of his retinue at the center of the hold of his personal stormbird, despite the violent turbulence of their descent. On open Vox channels, broadcast to his entire drop company, he promised that the traitorous sons of Horus would taste defeat at the hands of the White Scars, and that the fangs of the Emperor would be delivered a victory by the intervention of the 5th Legion. Little more was spoken, and instead the Khan let the wrath of their guns speak of their intentions as they opened fire on the traitors. Battle raged across the surface of Beta Garmon 10, with fronts opened where the fangs of the Emperor had made planetfall. Prior to the traitors' occupation, the planet had once housed penal colonies of billions within towering incarceration stacks, built from prefabricated ferrocrete modules that were added as the population dictated. Around them, the vast plains had been stripped of vegetation and utilized to train and harden Imperial army troops to the conditions of combat throughout the galaxy. To escape from incarceration on Beta Garmon 10 had been to flee into an active firing range, littered with explosive mines, ordnance, and the furnishings of a deadly battlefield. Most now found use under the control of the Warmaster's armies, many becoming gene forges filled with rows of amniotic tanks and surgical slabs as far as the eye could perceive. Penal facilities had become strongholds studded with hardened bunkers, clad in ferrocrete and bristling with automated weaponry that watched over conveyance lines, constructed to ship cargo to and from the landing pads that had been built on the featureless plains. With little attention paid to disabling the orbital guns of the enemy, or to establishing staging and resupplying points, Ha's troops had attacked indiscriminately, striking only at places where the presence of legionary resistance could be assured. 5th Legion troops were divided amongst these locations to reinforce the points at which Ha's assault had floundered. Spearheads of land raiders had led assaults on fixed positions where the fangs of the Emperor had been pinned down by enemy fire. Their armored hides were able to weather the explosive barrages that sent shrapnel scything through the ranks of Ha's infantry. When the distance had been closed, assault ramps opened like the jaws of howling beasts to disgorge the warriors of the 5th Legion in close assault. Bolt guns roared the fury of Chugores and silenced the sons of Horus's ranged weapons that had halted the advance of Ha's assault. Despite the entrenched positions held by the sons of Horus in the defense of the planet, the sudden influx of the White Scars and the ferocity of their assault was sufficient to unweight the defence and allow the Loyalists to gain a foothold. The traitor lines of defence were forced to fall back on themselves, but in doing so, they goaded the Loyalist attackers forth across killing fields that were overlooked by hardened positions that bustled with heavy support squads who brought autocannon and las cannon to bear. Undaunted, the White Scars reinvigorated their charge to once again close with their enemies, heedless of the price in blood that they were forced to pay. Path of Destruction. Yagatai Khan's target was a nexus of battle in the planet's southern hemisphere. As his Stormbird dropship approached for landing, the scale of the conflict already fought here became apparent. With the roads that ran between the squat grids of functional structures littered with both dead sons of Horus and a great number of the fangs of the Emperor. At the junctions between the roads, tank hulls still burned inside the craters that they had punched into the surface as they had exploded. The rear section of a Felglaive smouldered, the front rendered into a molten pool of white-hot slag by the cyclonic melter lance of the Leviathan dreadnought that itself lay motionless, its ceramite hide pocked with molten shrapnel, only several paces away. What parts of the Felglaive that remained identifiable were still larger than the Deimos Rhino chassis that were scattered around it. Upturned and draped in the bodies of their occupants, gunned down as they had tried to escape from the inferno of burning promethium fuel that had engulfed them. Amidst the wreckage and death, a path could be discerned. Ha's warriors had pressed their assault through the enormous armoured blast doors of a cavernous hangar and into the dark interiors of the Gene Forge, Natus 17. No cordon had been left by the fangs of the Emperor to prevent them from being pursued and surrounded by their enemies, and thus it fell to the Khan to implement such measures, apportioning companies from his strike force to hold their position and prevent the ingress of traitor forces into Natus 17, as he led the remainder of his contingent into the depths of the unknown structure. Soon after they had been deployed, the White Scars that held the gates of Natus 17 were beset by indentured forces of the Warmaster, cohorts of the Solar Auxilia that no longer bore their heraldry, and instead each warrior now bore crude renderings of the Eye of Horus upon their uniforms. Thousands of auxiliaries marched upon their position, driven before squadrons of Lehman Gruss battle tanks that advanced in support. Entrusting his rear guard to hold against the enemy forces that amassed outside, the Warhawk and his company advanced at a pace to reach the front line of the fighting, now within Natus 17, several levels below the surface of the planet. Endred Ha himself was at the forefront of the fighting, locked in combat with a contempted dreadnought adorned with vicious spiked studs and draped in chains of black iron. Upon its emerald green armour it wore an accumulated film of gore and soot that stained it a glossy burgundy brown. The dreadnought bore down upon Ha, grasping with the bladed claws of its two massive power fists, but the former World Eater sidestepped each blow, batting away the enraged attacks of the war machine with his own mighty fist and causing it to stumble forwards, overbalanced. Instinctively, Ha lunged and tore the atomantic core from the rear of the Contemptor's chassis, ripping out power conduits and cables like a biomechanical spinal cord, causing the reactor to overload and explode in a miniature supernova. The surrounding warriors, both fangs of the Emperor and sons of Horus engaged in combat, blade against blade, were caught in the blast, and several were immolated by the sunfire that enveloped them. Ha himself was blasted from his feet and thrown through the air, but even as the brief instant of brightness was still fading, he had regained his footing. As he scanned his surroundings to regain his awareness of the battle, his eyes fell upon the figure of Yagatai, and with a grimace upon his face in acknowledgement of his presence, Ha once again charged headlong into his enemies and spared no more time on welcoming the arrival of his allies. Yagatai followed in kind, bounding through hordes of enemies that climbed from the depths of Natus 17 to oppose them. Veteran warriors, sons of Horus, that had formed part of the original garrison force of Beta Garmon 10, were now only 1 in every 10 of the traitor force. The rest were inductii warriors, awoken from their hypno-indoctrination to defend the planet of their birth. So new to their lives as space marines were they, that they pressed forward without the cohesion of squad organization, there having been no time for their masters to assign such roles to them. Although just meters apart, the Khan could snatch only glimpses of Endred Har amidst the press of power-armored bodies that filled the chamber of the interior of the structure. In each he saw a snapshot of the pure brutality, frozen in the stroboscopic flashes of light from the thousands of bolt rounds that were discharged in the space between each of his breaths. One moment he saw Har crush the windpipe of an unhelmed warrior with a blow to the throat. The next he wielded the disembodied limb of one of Horus's sons as a weapon against the warrior it had been detached from. The Khan could not help but find humor in the situation, and allowed a smile to spread across his blood-spattered face. The Khan himself fought with the force of a hurricane, each sweep of his blade cutting down half a dozen of his foes, but over their lifeless bodies stepped ever more to replace them. His armor's systems registered the impact of blows against his body, but he no longer felt them. His muscles were saturated by the acidic burn of their superhuman exertion, unnumbed to any other sensation. As a shockwave of the detonation of a massive breaching charge washed over him, a bomb set to bring down the defense of the traitors, the din of battle was temporarily drowned out, and in a brief moment of calm, the Khan saw his sons as they fought. Even combined with the warriors of the fangs of the Emperor, they were outnumbered, with 5 or more sons of Horus for every one of the loyalists that still stood. In the face of such an enemy, where others may have faltered, the spirits of the White Scars sang in unison, spurring each of them to feats beyond even that of their augmented physiologies. Relishing in the destruction that they wrought, the Warhawk and the Riven Hound fought side by side at the front of their assault into the Gene Forge. Although they did not speak, they were united as warriors upon the field of battle. There was no need for words to express their bond. Their enemies fell in droves before the combined might of the White Scars and the fangs of the Emperor as they forged a path of blood and destruction into the central atrium of Natus 17. At the heart of the forge were the gene vats, within which new progenoid glands were grown, enough to implant into hundreds of thousands of inductii warriors and rebuild the strength of the 16th anew. Here, the coalition of loyalists had found a wellspring of the Warmaster's strength, the means by which Horus leveraged his conquest of the Garmon Cluster, and here they would bring about its destruction. With cleansing Promethean fire, they purged the gene forges of their stocks, toppling the fluid-filled silos and calling on flamer teams to incinerate their contents as they spilled upon the ground. They raised an inferno as a means to create thousands of traitor reinforcements was destroyed. The Khan received reports of numerous similar facilities uncovered as his forces fought to take Beta Garmon 10 sector by sector. He ordered them all to be committed to the same end, their gene stocks burned to ash and their structures razed. 5th Legion logisticians estimated that enough resources had been stored within the planet's facilities to build a force of Legion strength. Hundreds of thousands of warriors that would doubtlessly have been committed to the battle for the core systems. Beta Garmon was left under the control of Endred Har and the fangs of the Emperor, who pledged to prevent it once again falling under the control of the Warmaster. Extant records suggest that Har's forces rebuilt at least one working gene forge at the site, or otherwise discovered the location of one that was not destroyed under the watch of Yagatai Khan. Through its use, his warband was reinforced with a number of inductii recruits, each created from the unwilling people of the Garmon Cluster, and its strength was bolstered. Epilogue. After 7 years of torturous conflict, the Garmon Cluster had seen atrocities to rival any theatre of war that had or would ever exist. Billions were lost, and planets were scoured of life, rendered uninhabitable by dread weapons wielded by those who exercised the power of vengeful deities. Entire armies had been eradicated, those both aligned to the Emperor and to Horus, and those who survived had done so only by guile or by chance, for none had been spared a modicum of mercy. Such were the wars of an age of unparalleled darkness. Those on Terra had watched as the Garmon cluster had been set ablaze. The hellish glow of the fires of its destruction had grown ever brighter with each planet and system that was burned. Although these wars were still beyond the horizon, they loomed now with ever-increasing threat, as if the clash of blades and cries of the dying could be heard, carried on cold winds that blew in from distant mountains. Sanguinius had done all that Dorne had asked, more than any could have expected him to achieve. He had led his legion on a crusade into the heart of darkness, into the crucible fires of battle of an apocalyptic scale. He had been the carrier of light that had rallied the forces of the Imperium under his banner, and he had stood in defiance of the arch-traitor Horus. Although the Garmon cluster had been lost, the great angel had taken his measure of the Warmaster's strength, and he now knew what would confront him at the gates of Terra. The weight of knowing was shared only with the Warhawk, the one other that had faced Horus in his ascended state and knew of the power that he wielded. The Khan had fought a war on his own terms. He had reaved across the Garmon cluster, harrying at the heels of the Warmaster's armies to undermine their strength. Yagatai had won his victory at Beta Garmon, an act that may have changed the course of the war for the core systems. Although he had survived to prove his worth in comparison to Sanguinius, and he had suffered for his aspiration and hubris, he too had witnessed the power that Horus now wielded, and he too knew what challenges the Imperium was yet to face. Both of the Primarchs had found allies within the Garmon cluster, those they had aided, or those that had fought alongside them to thwart the traitor host. Shadrach Meduson had played a role in the Khan's crusade, and it could be said that it was to him that the Warhawk owed his life. But now their paths diverged. Meduson would fight on separately within the Garmon cluster and beyond. The bitter enmity between him and Tybalt Mar would only end with the death of one of them, and Ridhar would too remain within the sector, rebuilding and reforging the strength of the fangs of the Emperor, still filled with a hatred only felt by those who had been betrayed. Neither would return to Terra yet, for it was not their time. The message had reached the Imperial Palace, and word spread that Dorne's chosen champions, Sanguinius and Yagatai, both still lived, and that they made way to the Sol system. The people of Terra celebrated this victory in itself, jubilant that the protectors of humanity returned to once again take their place upon the walls. The people, however, were ignorant of the immensity of the horrors that would be soon upon them, for an army wrought of darkness itself, that thirsted for the blood of the Imperium, burgeoned. Horus's followers had amassed as water behind a dam, and the final levy was on the verge of failing. Soon, a flood would come to engulf Terra, and it held the power to wash away all that had been built in the name of mankind. Horus would return to Terra. End quote.